Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. When I first inherited the mansion in Savannah, I was thrilled. The place had this grand old-world charm that just begged for restoration. But the moment I set foot inside, something felt off. It wasn't just the musty smell or the creaky floors, it was a presence. You know that chilling sensation when you feel someone's eyes on you? That's how it felt, like I wasn't alone, even when I clearly was. At night, it got worse. I'd lie in bed and I swear I could hear faint music, like a broken piano playing somewhere deep in the house. I figured it was my mind playing tricks, but then I saw her, this shadowy figure gliding through the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. She didn't seem real, just a dark blur that moved too smoothly to be human. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I knew it wasn't good. I asked the locals about it, hoping for some rational explanation. Instead, they told me the eerie legend of the woman who lost her children in a fire that had once ravaged part of the house. Apparently, her spirit still haunts the mansion, trapped in an endless cycle of grief. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house sounded like her footsteps, inching closer. The restoration process was slow, and with every nail hammered into the walls, her presence became more intense. Things started moving on their own. Tools misplaced, windows flung open, cold spots that made my breath visible even in the middle of summer. It was as if the house itself was fighting against the change, like it didn't want to be touched. Then one night, it escalated. I was working late, and out of nowhere, the piano in the parlor started playing again, louder this time, and much clearer. My hands shook as I walked towards the sound, but when I reached the room, the keys were still. That's when I saw her, standing by the fireplace, her face barely visible in the dim light. Her eyes, empty, haunting, locked with mine. I froze. I tried to rationalize it, but how do you explain seeing a ghost? She didn't disappear right away. She just stood there, staring, like she was trying to tell me something. Then, without a sound, she vanished, leaving behind only that lingering sense of dread. The next day, I found the piano covered in soot, like it had been through a fire, even though the rest of the room was untouched. As the renovations neared completion, the haunting became violent. Doors slammed, pictures flew off the walls, and once, I felt a hand on my shoulder when no one was there. I considered leaving, but something kept pulling me back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was already too far gone. Either way, I couldn't just abandon the house. One night, I woke to the smell of smoke. Panicking, I rushed downstairs expecting to find the house in flames, but there was nothing. No fire, no damage. Just her. This time she was closer, her face clearer, twisted with sorrow and rage. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. It was chilling. I knew then that she wasn't just haunting the house, she was trying to stop me from erasing her past. I realized that finishing the restoration meant erasing the last remnants of her children, and she couldn't let that happen. I had to make a choice. Either finish the job and risk her wrath, or leave the house as it was, frozen in time. In the end, I chose to stop. Maybe it was out of fear, or maybe it was out of respect for her tragic story. Either way, I packed my bags and left. To this day, the mansion stands, half restored, with her presence still lingering inside. Some say they can still hear the faint music at night, the eerie sound of the broken piano playing for no one. And if you're brave enough to walk those halls, you might just see her, watching, waiting, and mourning the loss she can never escape. It was supposed to be just a thrill, you know? A group of us friends decided to explore this abandoned cathedral in New Orleans. We had heard all the spooky stories about it, about how the bell tower hadn't rung in years and was sealed shut. But of course, we were young and curious, eager to see if we could catch a glimpse of anything strange. The city has this eerie vibe at night, especially around places like that. We figured, at worst, we'd just freak ourselves out for fun. We stepped inside the cathedral just before midnight, flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. It was silent, dead silent. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. The building was crumbling, with vines creeping through the shattered windows, and dust seemed to cling to the air like fog. As we moved deeper into the hall, the silence was broken by the faintest of sounds. Bells. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then the others heard it too. A soft, distant toll, like it was coming from far above. We looked at each other, confused. The bell tower was sealed. There was no way those bells could ring. One of my friends, Max, swore it was just some old mechanism groaning in the wind, but we all knew better. It wasn't random noise. The bells were deliberate, like they were summoning something. We felt it in the air, this eerie tension that made it hard to breathe. We should have left right then and there, but we didn't. Curiosity got the best of us. That's when the legend of the priest crossed my mind. I'd heard about him growing up in New Orleans. He was the one who supposedly summoned something dark by ringing the bells decades ago and disappeared the same night. They said his spirit still roamed the cathedral, restless and waiting for someone to cross his path. I dismissed it as a local ghost story at first, but hearing those bells, it made everything feel too real. Too close. We decided to stay and see what else might happen, though a part of me was screaming to get out. As we wandered through the pews, the air grew colder. I swear I could see my breath hanging in front of me. Then, out of nowhere, Max stopped in his tracks. His flashlight flickered, and in the dim light, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. A shadow sitting in one of the pews. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, like it was waiting for us to notice. We froze, whispering frantically about what to do. But before we could make a decision, the bells rang again, louder this time. The sound echoed through the cathedral, making the walls shake. The shadow stood up slowly, and that's when I knew we had made a huge mistake. Whatever that figure was, it wasn't human. It was tall, dark, and seemed to blend into the shadows around it, like it was made of the same darkness that filled the room. One of my friends bolted for the door, but the rest of us were stuck, staring as the shadow began to move toward us. It didn't walk like a person. It glided, almost like it wasn't bound by the same rules of reality. The bells kept ringing, faster now, almost frantic. My heart was racing. We had to leave. The legend about the priest suddenly felt all too real, and I didn't want to find out what he had summoned that night. Max was the first to vanish. One moment, he was right beside me. The next, he was gone. No scream, no struggle, just gone, as if the shadows had swallowed him whole. Panic set in. We raced toward the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge, no matter how hard we pushed. It felt like the cathedral itself was holding us hostage. The bells continued to toll, and with each ring, another one of us vanished, slipping into the darkness without a trace. By the time the last bell rang, I was the only one left. I don't remember how I got out. Maybe the door finally gave way, or maybe the spirit let me go. Either way, I stumbled into the night, breathless and alone. The cathedral loomed behind me, silent once again. There were no more bells, no more shadows, just the eerie quiet of a city that had seen too much. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Max and the others were never found. No bodies, no evidence, nothing. Just me and the memory of those haunting bells. I've never set foot in that part of New Orleans again. But sometimes, when the night is still, I swear I can hear the faint toll of a bell, calling me back. Camping at Lake Tahoe had always been on our bucket list, a perfect weekend getaway for me and my girlfriend Sarah. We heard the lake was beautiful and peaceful, so we didn't pay much attention to the local legends. People talked about a ghost bride, a woman who supposedly drowned on her wedding day, but we thought it was just a creepy story to spook tourists. That night, under the stars, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, and the lake looked serene, with the water lapping gently at the shore. It wasn't until late that night that we started to hear something strange. At first, it was subtle. A soft, eerie sound floating over the water, almost like a distant wail. We dismissed it, laughing nervously, convincing ourselves it was the wind or maybe an animal in the woods. But deep down I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was something haunting about the way the sound seemed to echo across the lake, making it impossible to ignore. The next morning, we found wet footprints around our tent. It was odd, considering we hadn't gone down to the water since setting up camp, and no one else was around. Sarah shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. The footsteps led from the lake to our tent, then vanished. That should have been the first real warning, but we were too caught up in enjoying our weekend to think about it. I told myself it had to be an animal or a trick of the morning dew. That night, the wailing returned, only this time it was louder, more desperate, almost like someone calling for help. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances, and she joked about the ghost bride coming to get us. But when she said it, there was fear in her eyes. We tried to sleep, but I could feel the tension between us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, like something was watching us from the dark. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, made my heart race. Around midnight, we heard footsteps again. This time, they were slow and deliberate, crunching the leaves outside our tent. I froze, listening as the steps circled us. Then came the unmistakable sound of wet fabric dragging across the ground. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it outside, but there was nothing there. Just the empty campsite and the quiet, chilling echo of footsteps fading into the distance. That's when we saw her. Down by the lake, just beyond the trees, a figure in white stood at the water's edge. Her gown clung to her body as if it had just been pulled from the depths, water dripping onto the shore. Sarah gasped, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. The bride was looking for something, or someone. Her face was obscured by her veil, but we could sense her sadness, her haunting presence seeping into the night air. We quickly retreated to the tent, trying to convince ourselves we were imagining things. But the ghost bride didn't stay at the water's edge. As the night dragged on, her wails grew closer, echoing around the camp. At one point, we heard her voice, soft, almost a whisper, calling out for her lost groom. The sound was chilling, as if her sorrow was etched into every syllable. I knew then that we were in serious danger. By the time we decided to leave, it was too late. The footprints were back, this time circling our tent in a tight, deliberate path. I swear I saw her shadow through the thin fabric, moving slowly, waiting for us to come out. Sarah was trembling, clutching my arm as we planned our escape. We needed to get to the car, but every time we thought about stepping outside, the wailing grew louder, almost mocking us. We eventually bolted. In the dead of night, we ran toward the car, not daring to look back. But as we reached the edge of the camp, I glanced over my shoulder and saw her standing in the middle of the clearing, her hand outstretched, beckoning us back. Her veil fluttered in the wind, and for a moment I thought I saw her face, pale, cold, and dripping with lake water. She wasn't looking for her groom anymore. She wanted us. We made it to the car and sped away, not stopping until we were miles from the lake. Neither of us spoke much on the way home, both too shaken by what we had witnessed. Even now, I can still hear her wail in my nightmares, that haunting call echoing over the lake. I don't know if she'll ever stop looking for someone to join her in the water, but I know one thing for sure. We'll never go back to Lake Tahoe. The night we decided to break into the old Philadelphia State Hospital was one of those decisions you instantly regret. It had been abandoned for years, a crumbling monument to the city's darker past. There were whispers about what went on inside, about the inhumane experiments performed on the patients. But we didn't care. We were urban explorers, always chasing the next thrill, and this place was top of the list for being downright eerie. Little did we know, it was about to become more than just an adventure. The place was massive, with long, echoing hallways and rusting doors that creaked with every gust of wind. Our footsteps echoed as we walked, the sound unnervingly loud in the emptiness. The deeper we ventured, the more oppressive the air became. It was like the walls themselves were soaked in sorrow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. Still, we pressed on, cameras ready to capture anything chilling or eerie. In one of the rooms, we found old patient records, yellowed with age and covered in dust. As we read through them, a pattern emerged. One doctor's name kept coming up, Dr. Holloway. He was obsessed with the afterlife, performing gruesome experiments on his patients in the hopes of communicating with the dead. My stomach turned as I read about the procedures he performed, and I could see the unease growing in my friends' faces too. That was when we first heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. We froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There shouldn't have been anyone else there. Slowly, we turned off our flashlights, letting the darkness swallow us as we strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, but when we peeked into the hallway, there was no one there. Just shadows that seemed darker than they should be, shifting in the corners of our vision. My heart raced, but we tried to laugh it off. We had come for a thrill, after all. As we ventured deeper into the hospital, strange things began happening. Doors slammed shut on their own, and lights flickered in rooms where there hadn't been power for decades. At one point, we saw a figure, pale, gaunt, and dressed in a hospital gown, standing at the end of the hall. We blinked, and it was gone. I wanted to leave right then and there, but something about the place pulled us further in, as if we needed to understand what had happened here. We reached the basement, where the most disturbing experiments were rumored to have taken place. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the temperature dropped noticeably as we descended the stairs. The walls were lined with rusting medical equipment, long since abandoned, but still reeking of fear and desperation. That's when the whispers began. Faint, indistinct, like voices coming from the walls themselves. My skin prickled with the haunting sensation that we were not alone. One of my friends, Josh, walked ahead, shining his flashlight into a nearby room. The second he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the building. We rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. From the other side, we could hear him screaming, banging on the door as if something or someone was in there with him. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, and Josh stumbled out, pale as a ghost, muttering incoherently about seeing faces in the walls. That's when we knew we had to get out. The hospital didn't want us there. As we turned to leave, the halls seemed longer, the shadows darker, and the air felt suffocating. Figures flickered in and out of view, always just at the edge of our vision. The patients, the ones who had suffered under Dr. Holloway's experiments, they were still here, trapped in the hospital that had been their prison in life. And now, they wanted us to join them. We rushed toward the exit, but the hospital wasn't done with us yet. The doors at the end of the hall slammed shut, trapping us inside. Desperate, we turned back, trying to find another way out. As we passed one of the old operating rooms, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing by the operating table. It was Dr. Holloway, or at least what was left of him. His eyes were hollow, his face twisted in a haunting smile, and he raised a scalpel in his bony hand as if inviting us to be his next patients. Just when I thought we were doomed, the front door burst open on its own, and we didn't waste a second. We ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, not stopping until we were far from that place. Even now, I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes, feel the cold touch of those forgotten souls brushing past me. The hospital stands abandoned, but the spirits trapped inside are far from gone. I'll never forget the sight of Josh's face that night. He never spoke about what he saw in that room, and I'm not sure I want to know. But one thing is certain. Philadelphia State Hospital is not just haunted. It's a place where the dead never left, and those who disturb their eternal rest may never escape. When I first moved into the old brownstone in Boston with my daughter, Emma, I thought we were starting a new chapter. The building had just been renovated, transforming an old orphanage into apartments. It seemed like the perfect place for us to build a new life. The landlord had mentioned the building's history, but it felt distant, almost irrelevant to us. Little did I know the past was far from forgotten within those walls. The first night was peaceful, but everything changed soon after. It started innocently enough. Emma would occasionally ask me if I heard a child crying at night. I brushed it off, thinking she must have been dreaming. The building was old, after all, and probably made strange noises at night. But the sound of crying seemed to grow louder each evening, and soon I began hearing it too, a faint, eerie wail drifting through the walls as if it was coming from the room next door. The odd thing was, the apartment next to us was vacant. Emma's behavior began to change. She started drawing pictures of a sad little boy. When I asked her who he was, she just shrugged and said, "He lives here." It sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't want to scare her, so I let it go. But things only got stranger from there. Toys would move on their own, often shifting places when neither of us was looking. Emma swore it was her new friend playing with them. I tried to stay rational, convincing myself it was just a phase or her imagination. One night, I heard the crying again, louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from Emma's room. I rushed in to find her sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room. She whispered, "He's sad because he can't find his mom." My heart pounded in my chest. I asked her what she meant, but she simply shook her head, as if afraid to say more. I held her close, trying to soothe her back to sleep, but the crying continued through the night. The next morning, I decided to investigate the building's history. After some digging, I uncovered the story of a little boy who had gone missing from the orphanage decades ago. His disappearance was never solved, and he was presumed dead, though his body was never found. The idea that his spirit could still be lingering, searching for someone, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The wailing we heard at night wasn't just some figment of our imagination. It was him. I couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's spirit had attached itself to Emma. She began talking about him more frequently, saying that he was lonely and wanted to play. I tried to be supportive, but there was something chilling about the way she spoke of him, as if she genuinely believed he was there. One evening, I found Emma playing with her toys, but one of the dolls was moving on its own, as if an unseen hand was guiding it. That was the moment I knew we were dealing with something beyond the ordinary. I was hired to restore a portrait in one of Charleston's oldest mansions, and at first I thought it was just another job. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Sinclair, warned me about the painting, saying it had a dark history. I chuckled politely, thinking she was just a superstitious old lady. After all, I'd worked with plenty of old artwork before, some with strange stories attached. But as soon as I laid eyes on the painting, I knew this one was different. The man in the portrait had a chilling, haunting gaze, almost like he was staring straight into my soul. The portrait was of a nobleman, one of the Sinclair ancestors from centuries ago, and the details were incredible. His expression, though, was unsettling, stern, with eyes that seemed to follow me around the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, judging my every move. Mrs. Sinclair told me that the man in the portrait had been rumored to make a pact with dark forces to gain wealth and power, and that anyone who tried to restore the painting faced strange accidents. I didn't believe in curses, but I couldn't deny the eerie vibe. As I began my work, I noticed something odd. The expression on the nobleman's face seemed to shift ever so slightly. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light. But no matter where I stood, his eyes seemed to follow me, colder than before. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling, but it lingered, chilling me to the bone. It didn't help that the room itself felt colder than the rest of the house, even though it was the middle of summer. I told myself it was just the mansion's age showing through. One afternoon, I left my tools on the table and stepped out for a break. When I returned, everything was scattered across the floor, as if someone had knocked them over in a fit of rage. I was the only one in the house at the time, and the windows were shut, so there was no breeze that could have caused it. I cleaned up the mess, trying to stay calm, but something about the nobleman's expression seemed different, more menacing, as though he was daring me to continue. The accidents started happening more frequently. A heavy frame nearly fell on me while I was working. My paintbrushes would disappear, only to reappear in strange places like under the furniture or in the hallway. One evening, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow, tall and looming, just standing there by the fireplace. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Mrs. Sinclair insisted that I stop, saying the portrait had always been cursed and it wasn't worth the risk. But I was stubborn. I didn't believe in curses, and I wasn't about to let a painting scare me off. Still, I couldn't deny the tension in the air. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch farther, darker, and at night I heard faint whispers, though I could never make out what they were saying. The house itself felt alive with a chilling energy, as if it was reacting to my presence. One night, I stayed late, determined to finish the restoration. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and the only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. I was nearly done with the portrait when the room went icy cold. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The nobleman's face had changed again. This time, his expression was one of pure rage. Before I could react, the lights flickered, and the shadow I had seen earlier appeared again, closer this time. My heart raced as I grabbed my tools and backed away from the painting. I could feel the presence in the room growing stronger, suffocating me with its intensity. The shadow moved closer, and for a split second, I swore I saw the nobleman's figure emerge from the painting itself, his eyes burning with fury. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a legend. The curse was real, and I was in way over my head. I dropped everything and fled the mansion, not even bothering to lock up behind me. I didn't care about the job anymore. All I wanted was to get as far away from that cursed portrait as possible. Mrs. Sinclair never contacted me again, and I never set foot in that house after that night. But the memory of those haunting eyes still lingers, burning into my mind every time I close my eyes. The mansion stands untouched since then, with the nobleman's portrait still hanging in its rightful place. Mrs. Sinclair never found anyone else willing to restore it. Rumor has it, anyone who spends too much time in that room starts to feel the same cold gaze watching them. Some say the nobleman's spirit is trapped inside the painting, waiting for someone foolish enough to try and finish the restoration. I'll never know for sure. But I do know one thing. That portrait was cursed, and it wanted to be left alone. We had heard about the lighthouse near Portland, Maine, how it was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a mad lighthouse keeper who shattered the lantern during a storm, causing a deadly shipwreck. Naturally, we were curious. My friends and I were always up for an eerie adventure, and this one seemed perfect. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years, sitting at the edge of the cliffs, weathered by time and storms. The locals warned us to stay away, but we didn't listen. We wanted to see if the stories were true. The first thing that struck us as we approached the lighthouse was how isolated it felt. The wind howled, and the ocean crashed against the rocks far below. But other than that, it was dead silent. The lighthouse stood tall, looming over the coastline like a forgotten sentinel. As we made our way inside, the air grew colder. It was summer, but the chill felt unnatural, sending shivers down my spine. We joked about the ghosts as we climbed the narrow stairs to the lantern room, but deep down, I felt uneasy. When we reached the top, the shattered lantern lay in pieces on the floor, just as the legend had described. The light had never been repaired, and the room was filled with the eerie remnants of that tragic night. As we stood there, I heard something faint, like a soft flickering sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I saw it. A dim, ghostly light at the far end of the room. It was faint, barely there, but it swayed as if it were trying to come to life. We all froze, staring at the light, unsure of what we were seeing. The locals had said that during storms, the old keeper's lantern would flicker, trying to warn ships away, even though the lighthouse had long been abandoned. But we hadn't expected to see it with our own eyes. As we watched, the light grew brighter, and I swear I heard the sound of footsteps behind us. When we turned around, there was nothing, just the empty staircase and the howling wind outside. But the feeling that we weren't alone was overwhelming. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on us. We decided to leave, but as we descended the stairs, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The wind outside picked up, and the lighthouse itself seemed to groan under the pressure of the approaching storm. Just as we reached the bottom, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. My heart pounded as we tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. The storm was getting worse, and the lighthouse felt alive, like it didn't want us to leave. Suddenly, we heard a low, mournful whistle, like a ship's horn, echoing from the sea. But it wasn't just any ship. It was the ghostly wreck that the locals talked about, the one that sank because the lantern had gone out. I rushed to the window, and in the distance, through the storm, I saw the outline of a ship, barely visible through the mist and rain. It was sailing straight for the rocks, as if reliving its final moments. My blood ran cold. The ship was lost, just as it had been on that stormy night years ago. The keeper's spirit was still trying to relight the lantern, desperately trying to warn the ships of the danger. But it was too late. We watched in horror as the ghostly vessel disappeared into the fog, and the sound of splintering wood echoed through the night, even though no ship had sailed those waters in years. The lantern above flickered once more, then died, plunging the lighthouse into darkness. We knew then that we had made a terrible mistake coming here. The door finally gave way, and we stumbled out into the storm, the wind and rain lashing at us as we ran for the car. But the lighthouse wasn't done with us yet. As we drove away, the dim light from the shattered lantern flickered behind us, growing brighter and brighter, as if the keeper's spirit was chasing us. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, trying to stay focused on the road. I couldn't help but feel that we had disturbed something we shouldn't have. Later, when we were safely back in town, we tried to make sense of what we had experienced. None of us could explain it. The shipwreck, the shattered lantern, the ghostly light, it was all too real. The locals were right about one thing: the lighthouse was cursed, and the keeper's spirit was still trying to save the lost souls who had perished in the wreck. But we had gotten too close, and now that curse seemed to follow us. I haven't been back to Portland since that night, and I don't think I ever will. Every now and then when a storm rolls in, I think about that ghostly light flickering in the distance, warning ships of a danger long forgotten. The keeper is still there, trapped in his endless duty, reliving that fateful night over and over. And if you're ever near the cliffs during a storm, you might just see his light flickering through the fog and hear the distant whistle of a ghost ship that never made it home. I've always been fascinated by cemeteries, the history, the stories, the lingering energy they seem to hold. So, when I heard about the strange happenings at Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago, I couldn't resist visiting. People talked about hearing soft sobs near a forgotten grave, a woman's voice mourning something lost. I figured it was just another ghost story, and being a paranormal investigator, I was always looking for the next chilling adventure. Little did I know, this one would stick with me in ways I never expected. It was late afternoon when I arrived, the sun sinking low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the tombstones. The cemetery itself was beautiful, serene, yet there was something eerie about the way the wind seemed to whisper through the branches. I walked along the worn paths, looking for the grave people spoke of, trying to keep my mind focused on the task. But even then, I could feel the weight of something unseen, pressing down on me, urging me to leave. After wandering for a while, I found it, an old, neglected grave, overgrown with weeds and barely legible. The name on the stone had faded, but the date stood out, 1692. That was the year of the witch trials in Salem. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I was standing at the grave of a woman who had been wrongfully accused of witchcraft and executed. Her remains had been buried without honor, and now her restless spirit lingered, crying out for justice. I stood there for a moment, expecting to feel something, but it was quiet, too quiet. Just as I was about to walk away, I heard it, a soft, eerie sobbing, like it was drifting through the air. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was unmistakable, a woman's cry, filled with sorrow. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The stories were true. I wasn't alone. The crying continued as I stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. I scanned the cemetery, but there was no one in sight. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a presence, something watching me from the shadows. I took out my camera, hoping to capture some evidence, but as I lifted it to take a picture, the crying suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, like the entire cemetery was holding its breath. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but my curiosity kept me rooted in place. I decided to stay a little longer, and as dusk settled in, things took a darker turn. The sobbing returned, louder this time, and it seemed to echo off the tombstones surrounding me. I turned to leave, but when I glanced into one of the cemetery's old cracked windows, I saw her, a pale figure with hollow eyes, standing just behind me. Her reflection was clear in the glass, but when I spun around, there was nothing. That's when I realized the stories hadn't mentioned this part. She wasn't just crying, she was following. Panic set in, but I kept my composure, determined to figure out what was happening. As I moved through the cemetery, the sobbing followed me, growing louder and more desperate. I could feel her presence, like a cold hand gripping my shoulder, and the shadows seemed to shift with every step I took. I knew I had to get out of there, but something held me back, something deeper than fear. It was as if she needed me to understand her pain, her loss. I rushed back to my car, heart pounding in my chest, but the moment I reached for the door handle, the sobbing stopped. Everything went quiet again, except for my racing heartbeat. I glanced back at the cemetery, and for a split second, I saw her standing at the gate, her face pale and gaunt, tears streaming down her cheeks. She raised her hand as if to reach out to me, but then she vanished, leaving only the chilling memory of her presence behind. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I researched the cemetery, trying to find out more about the woman who had been buried there, but records were scarce. All I could gather was that she had been wrongfully accused, her life taken by fear and ignorance. Her spirit was trapped in the cemetery, bound by the injustice done to her, and until someone acknowledged her story, she would never find peace. I've gone back to Oakwood Cemetery since then, but I've never heard her sobbing again. Some say that spirits only appear to those who are meant to help them, and maybe in some way I did. But the memory of her reflection in that window, her haunting gaze, stays with me. I can still feel her presence, like she's watching from a distance, waiting for someone to bring justice to her forgotten grave. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that her story isn't over. Maybe one day, someone will find the truth about her past, and her spirit will finally be laid to rest. But until then, the woman's cry will continue to echo through the cemetery, haunting anyone who dares to listen. I've always loved a good ghost story, so when I had the chance to stay at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, I jumped at it. The place is infamous for its hauntings, with guests over the years reporting all sorts of eerie encounters. But what really piqued my interest were the whispers. People claimed they could hear voices coming from the walls, especially at night. I figured it was all part of the hotel's charm, a clever way to keep the legend alive. Little did I know, I was in for something far more chilling than I'd expected. The hotel itself is beautiful, old, grand, and perched on the edge of the Rockies with breathtaking views. It has this aura about it, like you've stepped back in time. My room was on the top floor, where most of the ghost sightings had supposedly taken place. As I unpacked, everything felt normal enough. But there was this odd stillness in the air, like the hotel was waiting for something to happen. I brushed it off, eager to explore the place after dark. That first night, as I settled into bed, I heard it, the faintest of whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind outside, or maybe guests in the hallway. But as I listened more closely, I realized the voices weren't coming from outside. They were coming from inside the walls. I sat up, straining to hear, but the words were too muffled to make out. Still, the sound was there, a low, eerie murmur that sent chills crawling up my spine. The next day, I asked the staff about the whispers, and they laughed it off. "Old hotel, old pipes," one of them said. But I knew what I'd heard, and it wasn't the plumbing. I spent the day wandering the halls, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving just out of sight, a door closing on its own. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping, like a hushed conversation happening right behind the walls. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out what they were saying, but the words were too garbled. As the night wore on, the voices grew more frantic, as if they were trying to tell me something. My heart raced, and sleep felt impossible with that constant, chilling murmur in my ears. It was during one of my trips through the South that I first heard about the old train station in Chattanooga. It had been abandoned for years, falling into disrepair, but what intrigued me were the rumors about the ghost of a conductor who still haunted the station. The locals called him the spectral conductor, a man who had tragically died in a train accident back in the early 1900s. Being a historian with a fascination for the paranormal, I couldn't resist the chance to investigate. So one evening, I found myself standing in front of the decaying building, ready to explore its haunting past. The station was quiet, its once bustling platforms now empty and overtaken by nature. The air was thick with dust, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the old structure and the distant rustle of leaves. As I stepped inside, I was immediately struck by a strange sensation. A heaviness in the air, as if the station itself was holding on to something long forgotten. I had visited many haunted places before, but this felt different, like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I wandered through the station's corridors, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that seemed to whisper through the broken windows. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of a train whistle. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as I stood still and listened, it grew louder, more distinct. The odd part? The station had been closed for decades, and no trains had run through here since then. Intrigued, I followed the sound toward the old tracks, my heart racing with anticipation. As I reached the platform, the air seemed to shift, growing colder. That's when I saw him, standing at the far end of the platform, bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight. He wore an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, and though his features were blurred, I could make out the outline of his hat and the brass buttons on his coat. He was standing perfectly still, as if waiting for a train that would never arrive. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to leave, but my curiosity held me in place. As I watched, the conductor slowly turned his head toward me, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his gaze lock onto mine. There was something haunting about the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I swallowed hard, taking a step back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. The sound of the train whistle grew louder, and I could feel the vibrations of unseen wheels rumbling through the ground beneath my feet. Suddenly, the conductor raised his hand, pointing down the tracks. My pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, I thought I could see the faint outline of a train, shimmering like a mirage in the distance. The tracks seemed to come alive, humming with energy, but there was no train in sight, at least not one that belonged to this world. The conductor didn't speak, but I understood his message clearly. I needed to leave before the next train arrived, and I had the sinking feeling that if I stayed, I wouldn't be able to. The air around me grew colder still, and the faint sound of voices drifted through the station, like whispers carried on the wind. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the platform was empty, save for the spectral figure of the conductor. He remained motionless, his hands still pointing down the tracks. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that the voices weren't coming from the living. They were the echoes of passengers long gone, forever waiting for a train that would never arrive. With my heart racing, I turned and ran back through the station, the sound of the whistle growing fainter with each step. As I reached the exit, I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the conductor following me. But he remained on the platform, watching as I fled. The station doors slammed shut behind me, and the air outside felt warmer, more normal, as if I had just escaped something I wasn't meant to witness. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I did some digging and uncovered old documents, that detailed the tragic accident that had taken the conductor's life. There had been sabotage on the tracks, an act of greed and betrayal that led to the crash. The conductor had tried to stop the train, but it was too late. The story was buried in the past, forgotten by most, but his spirit remained, bound to the station, still trying to warn others of the danger. To this day, I can still hear the faint sound of that ghostly whistle when I think about Chattanooga Station. I haven't been back, but I know the spectral conductor is still there, waiting. The legend says that anyone who sees him is given a choice. Leave before the next train arrives, or risk boarding a train that will take you somewhere you can never return from. I made my choice that night, but I wonder how many others stayed too long and never came back. I've always been drawn to historical sites, and there's no place quite like Gettysburg. The battlefields are haunting on their own, but when you know the history, the bloodshed, the lives lost, it takes on an eerie energy. My partner and I decided to camp near the battlefield, hoping to experience that famous haunted atmosphere people always talk about. We weren't exactly ghost hunters, but there was something chilling about the idea of spending a night near where one of the bloodiest battles in American history took place. We thought it would just be a spooky adventure. We were wrong. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere changed. The battlefield stretched out before us, quiet and peaceful, but the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite explain. We set up our tent, the sound of crickets filling the silence, but beneath that, I swear I could hear something else. It was faint, almost like a low rumble in the distance. I brushed it off as the wind, but my gut told me otherwise. The stories about the battlefield started to feel a little too real. By the time night fell, the temperature had dropped sharply, much colder than it should have been for a summer evening. That's when we heard it. A distant boom, like cannon fire, followed by the eerie sound of men shouting in agony. It echoed across the field, but there was no one there. My partner looked at me, wide-eyed, but neither of us said a word. We knew what we were hearing wasn't normal. It felt like the battle was happening again, just beyond our sight. Curiosity got the better of us, so we grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the sound. The fog began to roll in, thick and unnatural, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. As we walked, the sounds grew louder. Shouts, the clashing of weapons, the unmistakable chaos of war. I kept telling myself it was just echoes from the past, but with every step I felt like we were walking into something we couldn't understand. Suddenly, out of the fog, we saw them. Ghostly figures, marching in formation, rifles in hand. They were dressed in the uniforms of Civil War soldiers, but their faces were pale, hollow, and expressionless. My heart raced as I stood frozen, watching them move across the field like they were trapped in time, reliving their final moments. I whispered to my partner, but my voice barely worked. This wasn't just a haunted sight. We had stepped into an eternal loop of battle. The soldiers didn't seem to notice us, their eyes fixed on some unseen enemy in the distance. We watched in stunned silence as they marched through the fog, their footsteps eerily quiet. It was like watching a scene from history, only we weren't spectators. We were part of it. The air was filled with the same rumble of cannon fire and the distant cries of men in pain. It was as though the battlefield itself was alive with the memories of the fallen. Just when we thought it couldn't get any stranger, the sounds grew louder, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. It felt like the battle was drawing closer, as if we were about to be caught in the middle of it. My partner grabbed my arm, and without a word, we turned and ran back toward the camp. The fog seemed to follow us, and I swear I could feel eyes on us, watching from the mist. We didn't stop running until we were back at our tent, breathless and terrified. But the sounds didn't stop. All through the night, we could hear the distant echoes of battle, cannon fire, musket shots, the cries of men in agony. We huddled together, trying to ignore it, but it was impossible to sleep. It felt like the battlefield was alive, and we were intruders, uninvited guests in a place that still remembered the pain and death that had occurred there. I had heard stories of the ghosts of Gettysburg, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. The next morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. The air was calm, the sun shining as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had seen something we weren't supposed to. The battlefield may have been quiet by day, but at night, it was a different story. It was as if the spirits of the soldiers were still there, trapped in an endless loop of battle, unable to find peace. And anyone who stayed too long risked getting pulled into that eternal war. Even now, I still think about those soldiers, marching through the fog, reliving their last moments over and over again. Gettysburg is a place where history and the paranormal collide, and the energy there is unlike anything I've ever experienced. I haven't gone back, but I've heard from others who have had similar encounters. Ghostly soldiers, distant cannon fire, the chilling sense that the battle is still being fought, even after all these years. There's something about Gettysburg that holds on to the past, refusing to let go. The soldiers who died there are still fighting, still marching, still crying out in pain, and if you're brave enough to camp near the battlefield, you just might hear them too. The Winchester Mystery House had always been on my list of places to visit. With its twisting hallways, staircases leading to nowhere, and doors that opened into walls, it was the perfect mix of bizarre architecture and eerie history. Sarah Winchester, the widow of the inventor of the famous rifle, built it in the hopes of confusing the spirits of those killed by the weapon. It was said that her spirit still haunted the mansion, forever trying to appease the restless souls. Naturally, I had to see it for myself. When I arrived with a group of tourists, the atmosphere felt off. The air was thick with a sense of mystery, like the house itself was alive, watching us as we explored its endless rooms. The tour guide talked about Sarah's obsession with construction, how she believed the constant building would keep the spirits at bay. I wandered through the strange halls, marveling at the sheer oddity of the design. But as we went deeper into the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. At one point, we entered a room with no windows, and the door clicked shut behind us. I tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the air was undeniable. The guide explained that Sarah had built these confusing layouts to trap the spirits, but it felt like we were the ones being trapped. A chill crept up my spine, and for a moment, I thought I heard soft footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there, just the flickering shadows cast by our flashlights. As we continued the tour, I noticed a woman in black lingering at the edge of our group. Her face was partially obscured by a dark veil, and something about her presence felt unsettling. I thought she was another tourist at first, but every time I looked her way, she seemed to vanish, only to reappear in the next room. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I kept it to myself, but her appearance sent a wave of unease through me. Who was she, and why did no one else seem to notice her? It wasn't until I got separated from the group that things took a turn for the worse. I had wandered into one of the twisting hallways, disoriented by the maze-like layout of the house. The silence was deafening. No voices, no footsteps, just the creaks of the old mansion settling. That's when I saw her again. The woman in black, standing at the end of the hall, her back to me. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that this was no ordinary tourist. This was Sarah Winchester herself, or at least her ghost. I called out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head, just enough for me to see a glimpse of her face under the veil. Her expression was one of sorrow, but her eyes were hollow, dark, like they were endless pits of grief. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity before turning and disappearing around the corner. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to move, following her down the hallway, though every instinct told me to turn back. The hallway led to a dead end, as most of them did in the house. But when I reached it, Sarah was gone. In her place, I found a single door, slightly ajar, leading into a small, dimly lit room I hadn't seen before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside, half expecting to see her waiting for me. Instead, I was greeted by an eerie silence and a strange, heavy energy that seemed to press down on me. The walls felt like they were closing in. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I rushed to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. My breath quickened, and the room seemed to grow darker by the second. That's when I heard it, a soft voice, whispering my name. It was faint, almost like a breeze, but unmistakable. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, knowing that I was no longer alone in that room. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and soon I could hear the faint sound of footsteps pacing back and forth behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the door to open. But the footsteps came closer, stopping just behind me. A cold hand brushed the back of my neck, and I gasped, spinning around. But there was nothing there, just the empty room, still and silent once more. When the door finally creaked open on its own, I bolted out of the room and down the hall, desperate to find my group. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. But the only thing I knew for certain was that I had encountered Sarah Winchester's ghost. She was still there, wandering her endless house, trapped in the maze she had built, forever searching for peace. I eventually found the others, but I didn't say a word about what I'd experienced. As we left the house, I glanced back at the mansion, half expecting to see her standing in one of the windows, watching us leave. The Winchester Mystery House lived up to its name, its secrets still buried within its walls, and its ghostly inhabitants still wandering its twisted halls. And I, for one, would never forget the feeling of being trapped in that haunted maze. It was late one evening when I decided to go for a run through Central Park. The city that never sleeps felt oddly quiet that night, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. The path was dimly lit by old lampposts, casting long shadows that seemed to move in the corner of my eye. I had heard the old urban legends about the park, ghosts, strange encounters, but I always thought they were just stories. That night, I learned the truth. As I made my way deeper into the park, I noticed her. At first, it was just a glimpse, a flash of white in the distance, near one of the old, twisted trees. I slowed my pace, my breath visible in the cool night air, and squinted to get a better look. There she was, standing perfectly still, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned gown. She was facing away from me, her long, flowing dress rippling slightly in the breeze. Something about her presence sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't look away. I approached cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel path. As I got closer, I realized she wasn't moving. Not even a shift in posture or the rise and fall of her breath, just stillness. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was intruding, like I was crossing some invisible line I wasn't supposed to. Finally, when I was only a few feet away, I cleared my throat to ask if she needed help. But before I could speak, she vanished. 1 second, she was there, and the next, she was gone, like a whisper carried away by the wind. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, searching for her. But there was nothing, just the eerie quiet of the park and the soft rustle of leaves. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? But deep down, I knew what I had seen. She was real. The next day, I couldn't shake the image of the woman in white from my mind. I started asking around, wondering if anyone else had seen her. That's when I learned about the legend, the Lady in White of Central Park. They say she was a bride, murdered in the park on her wedding day, and now her spirit roams the paths, searching for her killer, or perhaps waiting for someone to help her. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Had I come face to face with a ghost? The strange lights of Marfa, Texas had always intrigued me. People had been seeing them for generations, glowing orbs that appeared in the sky, moving in unpredictable patterns, vanishing and reappearing without warning. No one knew what they were, but the locals had their theories: spirits, alien visitors, or something stranger still. So when a group of paranormal enthusiasts invited me to camp out in the desert to study the lights, I didn't hesitate. This was my chance to see something truly eerie. We arrived just before sunset, setting up camp on the edge of the desert with a clear view of the horizon. The sky was a deep purple, and the air was still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. As the stars began to appear, we gathered around our equipment. Cameras, thermal scanners, anything we could use to capture evidence of the lights. The anticipation was thick, everyone waiting for that first glimpse of something unnatural. And then, just as darkness fell, they appeared. At first, it was just a single light, hovering low on the horizon. It flickered, then blinked out, only to reappear in a different spot. Soon, more lights joined it, swirling and darting through the sky like fireflies. They moved in ways no natural phenomenon should. Sharp, sudden movements, disappearing only to reappear somewhere else entirely. We stood there, transfixed, watching as the lights danced across the desert. But there was something chilling about the way they moved. Something almost purposeful. One of the group members, a local named Hank, told us the old stories about the lights. They weren't just a mystery, he said. They were beacons. According to legend, the lights were the spirits of lost travelers who had perished in the desert, searching for their way home. Anyone who followed the lights was said to disappear, drawn into the desert, never to be seen again. We all laughed nervously, but as I stared at the glowing orbs, I couldn't help but feel an eerie connection to those lost souls. As the night wore on, the lights grew brighter, more erratic. We watched them for hours, but then something strange happened. The lights began to move toward us. At first, it was subtle, just a faint shift in their direction. But soon, they were getting closer, their glow illuminating the desert sand around us. The air grew colder and the wind picked up, swirling around us like an invisible force. I could feel my pulse quicken, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Then we saw them, shadows moving between the lights. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I squinted into the darkness, I could make out figures. They were faint, almost transparent, like silhouettes walking through the glow. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what we were seeing. These weren't just lights, they were spirits. The figures moved slowly, almost aimlessly, like they were searching for something. Or someone. The group fell silent, our earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of dread. The lights continued to approach, the figures becoming clearer with each passing moment. One of the shadows passed right in front of us, and I swear I felt a cold breeze brush past my arm. My instinct was to run, but I was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the ghostly procession unfolding before us. The legends were true. The lights were beacons, guiding lost souls through the desert. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped and turned toward us. Its face was indistinct, but I could feel its eyes on me, locking onto mine. My chest tightened as a wave of fear washed over me. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, cold, otherworldly, and desperate. It was then that I understood what Hank had meant. These spirits weren't just wandering, they were looking for someone to join them, to lead them out of the desert, and we were standing right in their path. The light swirled around us, and the wind grew stronger, whipping sand into our faces. The figures continued their slow march, passing through us as if we weren't even there. I grabbed my gear, urging the others to do the same. We needed to get out of there, fast. As we packed up, the lights began to dim, retreating back into the distance, but the feeling of being watched never left. Even as we hurried back to our cars, I could still feel those ghostly eyes on me. By the time we reached the safety of the road, the lights had disappeared entirely, leaving only the dark, quiet desert behind. We didn't talk much on the drive back to town. What could we say? We had gone looking for answers, and we had found something far more chilling than we expected. The lights of Marfa were no simple mystery. They were the restless spirits of the desert, forever searching, forever lost. I've been back to Marfa a few times since that night, but I've never camped out in the desert again. The lights still appear, dancing on the horizon, and sometimes I catch a glimpse of those shadows moving between them. I don't know what they're looking for, but I do know one thing. If you follow the lights, you might never come back. Determined to find out more, I returned to the park that night. This time, I wasn't running. I was looking for her. The park felt different, darker, as if it knew I was there for a reason. I retraced my steps from the night before, my eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement in the distance. And then, just as I reached the same twisted tree, I saw her again. She stood in the exact same spot, motionless, her gown glowing faintly under the moonlight. I hesitated for a moment, fear gripping my chest, but I forced myself to walk closer. This time I called out to her, my voice shaky but clear. "Do you need help?" I asked, my words hanging in the air. She didn't respond, didn't turn around, but I could feel her presence, heavy and cold, like the air around her was frozen in time. I took another step, and as I reached out to touch her, she turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. For a moment, we locked eyes, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me. It wasn't just fear, it was sorrow, deep and consuming. Before I could say anything, she vanished again, leaving me standing there, breathless and alone. I raced home, my mind spinning with questions. Who was she? Why did she appear to me? The legend said she sought justice, but what if she was looking for something more? Over the next few nights, I returned to the park, hoping to see her again, but she never appeared. The path by the twisted tree remained empty, the only sounds the wind and the distant hum of the city. To this day, I still think about the lady in white. Some say spirits only reveal themselves to those who can help them, and maybe that's why she appeared to me. Maybe she thought I could uncover the truth about her death. Or maybe she's still waiting for someone to bring her peace. I don't know if I'll ever see her again, but I do know one thing. Central Park holds more secrets than anyone realizes. So, if you're ever running through the park late at night, keep an eye out for the lady in white. She may just be watching, waiting for the next person brave enough to follow her into the shadows. Mardi Gras in New Orleans had always been on my bucket list. The colors, the music, the energy, it's a celebration like no other. My family and I decided to make the trip, renting an old townhouse in the French Quarter. The place had history, that's for sure. The owner mentioned that it had once survived a fire decades ago, but we didn't think much of it at the time. We were too excited about the parades and the festival. The first night in the house was magical, but that was before everything started to unravel. Our kids, Tim and Lily, were the first to notice something strange. They said they heard laughter and the sound of a party coming from the attic while we were downstairs. We thought it was just part of the Mardi Gras atmosphere seeping into the house. After all, New Orleans never really sleeps. But when we checked the attic, it was empty. The air was thick with dust, and there were old toys scattered around, like relics from another time. It was unsettling, but we chalked it up to the charm of staying in an old house. The next day, the kids were eager to join the Mardi Gras festivities, so we took them to see the parades. They had a blast, collecting beads and masks and soaking in the atmosphere. But that night, back at the townhouse, the laughter returned. Only this time, it was louder. It sounded like a group of children playing just above us, their footsteps running back and forth. My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances. But again, when we checked, the attic was empty. Things took a darker turn the following evening. The kids had fallen asleep early after a long day of festivities, but I woke up in the middle of the night to find their beds empty. Panic set in as we searched the house, calling their names. There was no answer. Then we heard it, faint giggles from the attic. My heart raced as we rushed upstairs, hoping to find them. But all we found were their Mardi Gras masks, lying on the floor, eerily arranged in a circle. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The attic was empty, but the laughter continued, echoing through the walls. It was like the children were just out of reach, playing some kind of sick game. We called the police, but they found no signs of forced entry, no evidence that the kids had even left the house. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving only their masks behind. The police tried to reassure us, but we knew something was terribly wrong. Desperate for answers, I began researching the history of the townhouse. That's when I stumbled upon the story of a fire that had swept through the French Quarter decades ago. The townhouse had been hosting a children's masquerade ball when the fire broke out, trapping everyone inside. Most of the children didn't make it out. Their bodies were never recovered, and the house had stood empty for years afterward. The local legend was that their spirits still lingered, searching for playmates to join them. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Our kids weren't just missing, they had been taken by the spirits of the lost children, drawn into their endless masquerade. I couldn't accept it. I refused to believe that they were gone for good. My wife and I stayed up all night, calling their names, searching every corner of the house, but it was no use. The only sound was that haunting, eerie laughter echoing through the attic. We didn't leave the house, hoping that somehow the children would return. But as the days passed, the laughter grew louder and the footsteps became more frantic, like the children were playing some twisted version of hide and seek. Every time we went up to the attic, we found more masks. Old, cracked masks from a different time, arranged in strange patterns on the floor. It was as if the spirits were mocking us, taunting us with their presence. One night, I heard Lily's voice. She was calling out to me from the attic, her tone light and playful. My heart nearly stopped. I rushed upstairs, my hope reignited, but when I reached the attic, there was no sign of her, just the masks scattered across the floor. But this time, one of them was different. It was a new mask, one I hadn't seen before, and it looked just like Lily's face, frozen in a twisted, eerie smile. That was the moment I knew the truth. Our children were gone, trapped in that endless masquerade with the lost souls of the fire. The house had claimed them, and there was nothing we could do to bring them back. We left New Orleans the next morning, broken and hollow, but the laughter still haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear it. The giggles of children playing in the attic, calling for me to join their eternal game. The townhouse still stands in the French Quarter, its doors closed to the living. But those who pass by late at night say they can hear the faint sound of children laughing, their voices echoing through the narrow streets, waiting for the next family to join their endless celebration. I've always had a fascination with Salem, Massachusetts, the infamous home of the witch trials. The town carries a haunting atmosphere, like it's still shrouded in the shadows of its dark past. So when I had the opportunity to move there for a short research project on the trials, I couldn't pass it up. I found a small, charming house to rent, one of the oldest in town. The realtor mentioned it had once belonged to a woman accused of witchcraft during the trials, but I didn't think much of it. Salem was full of such stories, and I was more interested in the history than the local ghost tales. That changed soon enough. From the moment I moved in, things felt off. The air was heavy, and the house had a strange stillness to it, like it was waiting. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, fueled by my excitement to be living in such a historical place. But within days, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost laughable incidents. Books falling off the shelves, doors creaking open on their own. I chalked it up to the house's age, telling myself old places like this have quirks. But the events escalated quickly. One night, I heard a crash from the kitchen. When I went to check, every cabinet door was wide open, and dishes had been thrown across the floor. My heart pounded as I stood in the doorway, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign of an intruder, no broken windows. The house was locked tight, and I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. I convinced myself it was nothing, probably just a fluke. But the activity grew worse. Lights flickered, furniture moved on its own, and strange cold spots appeared throughout the house. Then, late one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I froze, straining to listen. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving closer to my bedroom. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, waiting for it to open. But the steps stopped just outside, and the air went still again. After that, I couldn't sleep. Every night brought something new. Doors slamming, objects flying across the room, the faint sound of whispers in the walls. The house had come alive, and it was angry. I started to feel like I was being watched, even during the day. I would catch glimpses of shadows out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The worst part was the growing sense of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. That's when I learned about the previous owner, a woman named Eliza, who had been accused of witchcraft during the trials. She was one of the unlucky ones, hanged after a swift and unjust trial. Her house was left abandoned for years afterward, with rumors that her spirit lingered, seeking revenge on those who dared live in her home. I had unknowingly walked right into her domain. One night, things came to a terrifying head. I was lying in bed, trying to block out the sounds of objects moving in the next room, when the temperature in my bedroom dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air, and then I felt it, a presence at the foot of my bed. Slowly I sat up, and there she was, a woman in dark clothes, her face pale, her eyes empty and black as night. She stared at me, unblinking, her mouth twisted into a cruel, cold smile. My blood ran cold, and I couldn't move, trapped by her gaze. I tried to speak, but no words came out. Eliza didn't say anything, just stood there watching. After what felt like an eternity, she slowly turned and walked out of the room. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the house. The poltergeist wasn't just angry, she wanted me gone. I had become her new target, and there was no escaping her wrath. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The next morning, I packed my things and left Salem. I didn't care about the research project anymore. I didn't even tell the realtor why I was leaving so suddenly. I just wanted to get as far away from that house as possible. But even now, I can still feel Eliza's presence, like she's watching me from a distance, waiting for her next chance to strike. The house remains in Salem, standing as a quiet reminder of its dark past. But if you ever find yourself walking by late at night, you might hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway or the slamming of doors. And if you're unlucky enough to move in, be warned. Eliza is still there, still angry, and still looking for someone to take the blame for her fate. I've always been drawn to the ocean, so when I heard about the sunken shipwreck off the coast of Key West, I couldn't resist the chance to explore it. The wreck was said to be from a pirate ship that went down centuries ago, and rumors swirled about hidden treasure still buried beneath the sea. I wasn't much for ghost stories, but the locals warned me about the dangers of diving near the wreck. They whispered about the drowned crew, whose spirits still haunted the waters, guarding the treasure they'd died for. I shrugged it off. I'd been diving for years, and besides, ghosts weren't real. At least that's what I thought. The day of the dive, the water was calm, and the sky was clear, a perfect day for exploring the depths. I geared up and descended into the turquoise waters, the sun's rays filtering through the waves above me. The wreck loomed below, half buried in the sand, its timbers weathered and covered in coral. It was a beautiful, eerie sight. As I swam closer, the temperature dropped, and the water grew darker, as if the ocean itself was warning me to stay away. But I pushed forward, eager to see what treasures lay hidden in the depths. As I explored the wreck, I began to feel uneasy. The water was too still, too quiet. I had expected to see fish and marine life, but the area around the shipwreck was completely deserted. That's when I saw the first figure, just a shadow at the edge of my vision, floating among the wreckage. At first, I thought it was another diver, but when I turned to get a better look, the figure had vanished. My heart raced as I scanned the area, but there was no one else around. I was completely alone. At least, I should have been. The deeper I went, the more I saw them. Shadowy figures drifting through the water, their movements slow and unnatural. They weren't other divers. They weren't even alive. Panic started to set in as I realized I was surrounded by the spirits of the ship's crew, still floating through the wreckage, guarding the treasure they had died for. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that the shadows were tricks of the light, but the cold grip of fear had already settled in. One of the figures drifted closer, and for the first time I could see it clearly. The ghostly form of a man, his face pale and sunken, with eyes that seemed to glow in the murky water. His clothes were tattered, the remnants of a pirate's uniform, and his body moved in slow, haunting motions. My chest tightened as the figure floated toward me, his hand outstretched as if to grab me. I kicked hard, trying to swim away, but the water felt thick, like I was moving through a nightmare. As I swam toward the surface, the other figures closed in, their ghostly shapes swirling around me like a vortex. The water seemed to grow colder with every stroke, and I could feel their presence, watching me, pulling at me, trying to drag me down with them. I glanced down and my heart nearly stopped. One of the spirits had grabbed my ankle, its bony fingers cold as ice, pulling me back toward the wreck. I kicked harder, desperate to break free, but the grip tightened, dragging me deeper. I struggled, my lungs burning as I fought to reach the surface. The figures swirled around me, their ghostly faces expressionless, as if they were already claiming me as one of their own. My vision blurred, and the pressure in my chest grew unbearable. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the grip on my ankle loosened, and I broke free. I swam for the surface with every ounce of strength I had left, the cold, ghostly fingers brushing past me as I ascended. When I finally broke the surface, gasping for air, I was shaking with fear. I swam back to the boat as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. Once on board, I ripped off my gear, trying to catch my breath. The water around the wreck was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. I had come face to face with the drowned ghosts of Key West, and they had almost pulled me into their watery grave. The locals were right. The spirits of the ship's crew still haunted the wreck, guarding the treasure that had cost them their lives. I never went back to that spot, and I've never spoken about what I saw beneath the waves. But sometimes, late at night, I can still feel the cold grip of those ghostly fingers on my ankle, and I wonder how close I came to becoming one of them. The wreck still sits at the bottom of the sea, its treasure untouched, guarded by the spirits of those who died for it. And if you ever find yourself diving off the coast of Key West, be careful. The drowned ghosts are still there, waiting for the next foolish soul to join them. San Francisco's old, abandoned theater had always been a point of fascination for me. It was once a grand venue, a place where the city's finest would gather to watch performances. But after a tragic accident on stage that claimed the life of the conductor during a performance, the theater was shut down and left to decay. The locals whispered that the ghost of the conductor never left, that late at night you could hear the sounds of his orchestra playing a piece that was never finished. Being part of a documentary film crew, we gained permission to enter the theater, hoping to capture some evidence of the haunting. The moment we stepped inside, the air felt different, thicker, colder. The grand hall, with its velvet seats and crumbling balconies, was cloaked in dust and silence. The stage, once alive with music and light, now sat in eerie darkness, with remnants of old set pieces barely visible. We set up our cameras, eager to document whatever paranormal activity we could find. The theater seemed to hold its breath, waiting. It was haunting, to say the least. As we explored the backstage area, the old dressing rooms, and the orchestra pit, the atmosphere became more oppressive. It wasn't just the cold or the darkness, it was the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of our flashlights seemed amplified, as if the theater itself was alive. We joked nervously, trying to keep the mood light, but none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Hours passed, and nothing unusual happened. We were beginning to think the stories were just that, stories. But then, around midnight, it started. Faint at first, like a distant memory, we heard music, soft, ghostly notes floating through the theater. It was unmistakable. A phantom orchestra was playing somewhere in the darkness. We stood there, frozen, listening as the music grew louder, more defined. The melody was haunting, eerie, as if it belonged to another time. The music seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding us. We rushed toward the stage, our cameras rolling, trying to capture the source of the sound. But the stage was empty, bathed in shadows. There were no musicians, no instruments, just the cold, dark air and the echo of the phantom orchestra playing its endless tune. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The music was so clear, so real, and yet there was no one there. Suddenly, the lights on stage flickered, dimming and brightening in time with the music. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. The conductor. He was faint, almost translucent, but his form was unmistakable. His suit, his posture, the baton in his hand. He stood at the front of the stage, waving his baton in rhythm with the ghostly music, leading his phantom orchestra in their final performance. We stared in disbelief, unable to move. The conductor's face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, yet his expression was focused, determined, as if he were still trying to perfect the performance he had died for. The music swelled, filling the theater with a sound so beautiful, and yet so chilling that it sent shivers down my spine. It was like the orchestra was playing from beyond the grave, following the conductor's every move. I raised my camera, hoping to capture the ghostly figure, but as soon as I did, the music stopped. The conductor lowered his baton, and for a moment, everything went silent. He turned to look at us, his hollow eyes locking onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished, leaving only the empty stage and the heavy silence behind. We stood there, stunned, trying to process what we had just witnessed. The theater was completely still, the air thick with the lingering energy of the phantom performance. It was as if the conductor had been trying to finish the piece he had started so long ago, his spirit forever tied to the music and the tragedy of that night. We packed up our equipment in a daze, unsure of what to say to each other. None of us had ever experienced anything like that before. As we left the theater, I couldn't help but look back at the stage one last time. In the dim light, I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow perhaps, or maybe it was just my imagination. But the memory of that ghostly conductor leading his invisible orchestra will stay with me forever. The theater remains abandoned, but I know the music never really stopped. Even now, when I think about that night, I can still hear the faint strains of that phantom melody playing somewhere in the distance. The conductor and his orchestra are still there, forever trapped in an endless performance that no one alive will ever see. And if you're brave enough to visit the old theater after dark, you might just hear the music too. When I heard that the old gold mine in Nevada City was reopening as a tourist attraction, I couldn't resist visiting. The town had always been known for its rich mining history, and the stories about the abandoned mine were legendary. Supposedly, the spirits of miners who had died in a cave-in still haunted the tunnels, forever searching for the treasure they were promised in life. Most people dismissed it as a local ghost story meant to entertain tourists, but I wanted to see the mine for myself. It was a chance to experience something thrilling, and maybe even uncover a piece of history. The tour guide was an older man who'd lived in the town his whole life. He took us deep into the mine, leading the way with a lantern, his voice echoing off the walls as he told stories of the mine's heyday. It was fascinating, hearing about the miners who had risked everything for a chance at striking it rich. But as we descended deeper into the mine, the air grew colder and the atmosphere shifted. What started as a historical tour quickly began to feel like something more ominous. About halfway through the tour, the guide stopped in front of a collapsed tunnel. He explained that this was where the cave-in had happened, killing several miners instantly and trapping others who had never been found. The guide's voice dropped to a whisper as he told us that the miners' spirits were said to still haunt the mine, endlessly digging for the treasure they never found. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the thought of being surrounded by restless souls. We continued through the tunnels, and that's when things started to get strange. I heard the faint sound of pickaxes clinking against rock, though there was no one else around. The sound echoed through the narrow passageways, growing louder the deeper we went. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But when I looked around, I saw the others in the group exchanging nervous glances. They heard it too. The guide didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was pretending not to. The deeper we went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, like a shadow flitting between the beams of the guide's lantern. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of unease was impossible to shake. The air grew colder still, and the once solid ground beneath our feet seemed to shift, as if the mine itself were alive, trying to pull us deeper into its darkness. Then we reached the deepest part of the mine, a large chamber where the gold had once been extracted. The guide was in the middle of explaining the mining process when the lights flickered and went out. Panic set in as we stood there in complete darkness, the only sound the rapid breathing of the group. I reached for my phone to use its flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I heard something. Faint whispers, coming from the walls. The whispers grew louder, and soon I could make out voices, though I couldn't understand what they were saying. My heart raced as I felt a cold breeze brush past me, even though there was no air circulation in the mine. The guide frantically tried to light his lantern, but his hands were shaking too much to get it going. In the pitch black, the clinking of pickaxes and the distant voices surrounded us. We weren't alone. Suddenly, a ghostly figure appeared in front of me, just barely illuminated by the flickering light of someone's phone. It was the outline of a man, dressed in tattered mining clothes, his face pale and gaunt. He was staring right at me, his eyes hollow, as if they'd seen more than any living person could bear. My breath caught in my throat as he raised his hand and pointed toward the collapsed tunnel behind us. I didn't need to be told twice. Whatever was happening here, we weren't welcome. We turned and ran, stumbling through the tunnels, the ghostly whispers following us. The sound of pickaxes grew louder, more frantic, as if the spirits were trying to dig their way out, and maybe trying to pull us down with them. The guide finally got the lantern working, and the faint light gave us just enough to navigate the twisting passageways. Every step felt like a battle against the darkness, and I could feel the cold, ghostly presence all around us. When we finally emerged from the mine, gasping for air, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the town. The guide, pale and shaken, refused to talk about what had happened inside. None of us did. But we all knew what we had seen and heard. The spirits of the miners were still down there, trapped in the very tunnels where they had died, forever searching for a treasure they would never find. I haven't gone back to Nevada City since that day. The mine remains open, a popular tourist attraction, but I wonder how many people leave feeling the same cold dread that I did. The legend of the haunted mine is real, and if you listen closely when you visit, you might just hear the sound of pickaxes echoing through the tunnels, and the whispers of those who never left. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a weekend in the Adirondacks with a group of close friends. We found an isolated cabin deep in the woods, miles away from any town or road. The perfect spot to disconnect from our busy lives. The cabin was rustic but cozy, nestled among towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. The first night was calm, the crackle of the fire and the sounds of the forest lulling us into a sense of serenity. We had no idea what was coming. The second night, everything changed. It started with strange noises outside, soft whispers carried by the wind, too faint to make out, but just loud enough to be unsettling. At first, we joked about it, convincing ourselves it was just the forest playing tricks on us. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was moving through the trees, circling the cabin. The air inside the cabin felt thick with unease, and none of us could shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, one of my friends noticed something carved into the wooden walls inside the cabin, symbols and markings we hadn't seen before. They were crude, almost ancient looking, and we had no idea what they meant. As we examined the carvings, a chill settled over the room. It wasn't just the cold mountain air seeping in through the cracks. There was something sinister about those markings, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We tried to brush it off and go to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. In the dead of night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps just outside the cabin, slow, deliberate steps crunching through the fallen leaves. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to listen. The footsteps circled the cabin and then stopped, right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but the footsteps simply moved on, disappearing into the forest once more. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Everyone was awake, listening in silence, too scared to speak. The next morning, we found strange markings in the dirt around the cabin, like something or someone had been walking around the perimeter. They weren't footprints exactly, but deep, jagged grooves that looked like they had been made by claws. We tried to rationalize it, convincing ourselves it was just an animal, but deep down, we knew something wasn't right. The forest around us felt different, darker, as if the trees themselves were closing in. That evening, we decided to leave early, but when we tried to start the car, it wouldn't budge. The engine sputtered, but it refused to turn over. We were stranded, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and no way to call for help. The sun was setting, and the forest seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each passing minute. The whispers in the wind returned, louder this time, almost as if they were calling to us. Panic started to set in. As night fell, the cabin seemed to come alive with strange noises. Scratches at the windows, the creak of the floorboards, and the low moan of the wind outside. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift in the firelight, almost as if they were moving. We huddled together in the main room, too terrified to go to sleep, but exhaustion eventually took its toll. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream from outside. We rushed to the window, but all we could see were the dark outlines of the trees, swaying in the wind. Then we saw it, movement just beyond the edge of the firelight. A shadow, tall and hunched, moving between the trees. It was impossible to make out its form, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. It stopped at the edge of the forest, staring at us, or at least, that's what it felt like. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. The shadowy figure retreated into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We stayed up the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, we packed up as quickly as we could, determined to hike out of the woods and find help. As we left the cabin, we noticed something that made my heart sink. The same strange symbols carved into the trees around the cabin, as if marking the boundary of whatever had been haunting us. The hike out was grueling, and the forest felt more hostile than ever, the trees closing in on us with every step. We didn't speak much, all of us too shaken by what we had experienced. When we finally reached the nearest town, we told the locals about the cabin. That's when one of the older men shook his head and told us the story of the recluse who had once lived there. He had been obsessed with dark rituals, summoning spirits from the forest. No one had seen him in years, but they said his presence still lingered, and so did the spirits he had called. We never went back to that cabin, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, hunted by something we couldn't understand. The Adirondacks may be beautiful, but there's something ancient and dangerous in those woods, something that doesn't like to be disturbed. If you ever find yourself near a remote cabin, deep in those mountains, listen closely to the wind. It might be whispering more than just the rustling of leaves. Boulder Creek, Colorado, was the kind of small mountain town where you could feel the history in the air. My friends and I had heard the stories, the legends of phantom footsteps that followed hikers along an old trail deep in the woods. Most people dismissed it as folklore, but for us, it was the perfect excuse for an adventurous weekend. We decided to head out on the trail, thinking we'd find a beautiful hike and maybe a good story to tell around the campfire later. We had no idea what was waiting for us. The first few miles were stunning. The crisp mountain air, the towering pines, and the distant sound of the creek made for the perfect backdrop. We joked about the phantom footsteps, laughing as we stomped extra hard on the trail, trying to spook each other. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, the lightheartedness started to fade. The trees grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the air became still, unnaturally still, like the forest was holding its breath. That's when we heard it. At first, it was faint, like the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. We stopped, thinking it was just another hiker behind us, but when we turned around, the trail was empty. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just an echo of our own footsteps, but the sound continued. It followed us. Every step we took, there was another, just slightly behind. My pulse quickened as the realization hit me. Someone, or something, was following us. The further we hiked, the louder the footsteps became. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence. The footsteps moved when we did, stopped when we stopped. My friends and I exchanged nervous glances, no longer making jokes. There was something out there, something unseen, and it wasn't going away. The air grew colder, and a strange fog began to roll in, thick and heavy, creeping between the trees and swallowing the trail ahead. As we moved deeper into the fog, the footsteps grew louder, almost frantic, like whatever was following us was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest as the mist thickened, making it harder to see more than a few feet in front of us. I could feel my skin prickling with unease. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting in ways that felt unnatural, like they were watching us too. It wasn't just the footsteps that were following us anymore. The whole forest felt alive, and not in a good way. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. We stood in silence, straining to hear, but the only sound was the distant gurgle of the creek. Relief washed over me for a moment. Maybe whatever had been following us had finally given up. But then, just as we were about to move forward, we saw them. Dark, shadowy figures, barely visible through the fog, standing motionless just off the trail. My stomach dropped. They weren't human, at least not anymore. The shapes were vague, but the outline of their clothing suggested miners, lost souls from Boulder Creek's gold rush days. One of my friends whispered that it had to be a trick of the light, but we all knew better. The figures didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching us, waiting. My skin crawled as I realized we had walked right into their territory, and they weren't going to let us leave so easily. The fog swirled around them, and though we couldn't see their faces, I could feel their eyes on us, cold and empty. The air grew colder still, and I knew we had to get out of there before they decided to follow us again. We turned and started walking back the way we had come, our pace quickening with each step. The footsteps returned, this time closer, louder. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see one of the shadowy figures right behind me. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet, but I could hear them, their footsteps matching ours, almost in perfect rhythm. They weren't just following us anymore, they were chasing us. We broke into a run, the footsteps pounding behind us, faster and faster. The fog swirled around us, disorienting, making the trail feel endless. My legs burned and my heart raced as I pushed forward, desperate to escape the unseen pursuers. The footsteps were so close now, I could almost feel their cold breath on the back of my neck. Panic set in, and for a moment, I thought we'd never make it out of the forest. Finally, we burst out of the fog and into a clearing, the sun breaking through the trees and lighting up the trail ahead. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had started, and the eerie silence returned. We slowed to a walk, gasping for breath, but we didn't dare stop until we reached the trailhead. When we finally did, we collapsed onto the ground, our bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear. None of us spoke for a long time. The footsteps were gone, but the memory of them still lingered, heavy in the air. We knew what we had experienced wasn't a figment of our imagination. The phantom footsteps of Boulder Creek were real, and the spirits of the lost miners were still wandering the trail, searching for something or someone to join them. We never went back to that trail. Every now and then, I hear about hikers who claim they've heard the same footsteps following them through the woods. Most people think it's just a local ghost story, but I know better. If you ever find yourself hiking near Boulder Creek, listen closely. The forest may be quiet, but you might not be alone. The abandoned schoolhouse on the outskirts of El Paso had been a local legend for as long as I could remember. People talked about the ghost of a teacher who died trying to save her students from a fire that destroyed part of the building over a century ago. Some claimed they heard her voice echoing through the halls, while others swore they saw ghostly figures of children still trapped inside, calling for help. My friends and I had heard all the stories, but we never thought much of them, until we dared each other to explore the place one night. The schoolhouse loomed ahead of us, its windows shattered, and the roof sagging from years of neglect. The desert winds howled through the broken glass, making it sound like the building was sighing, as if it had been waiting for someone to return. With flashlights in hand, we cautiously stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath our feet. The air was thick with dust, and a faint, burnt smell still lingered, even after all these years. I could feel my heart racing, but I kept telling myself it was just an old building, nothing more. As we made our way down the dark hallways, the atmosphere became more oppressive. The faded chalkboards and overturned desks gave the place an eerie, frozen-in-time feeling, like the students had just left moments before the fire. The deeper we went, the stronger the sensation of being watched became. My flashlight flickered, and that's when I heard it, the faint sound of chalk scratching against a blackboard. My stomach dropped. It was coming from one of the classrooms up ahead. We moved closer, the sound growing louder. When we reached the room, I hesitated before pushing open the door. Inside, the air felt colder, and the entire room was blanketed in dust. But on the blackboard, there was fresh writing, as if someone had just been there. It was a single word: help. My blood ran cold. No one else had been in the building for years, and yet the words stood out starkly against the grime-covered chalkboard, like a desperate plea from the past. Before any of us could say a word, we heard the faint sound of children's voices, soft, almost like a distant echo of the past. They were reciting a lesson, repeating the words in unison, though the words themselves were unintelligible. I glanced at my friends, and the look on their faces told me they were hearing it too. We stood there, frozen, listening as the ghostly lesson played out in the empty room. My skin crawled, and every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, the sound stopped, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Just as I was about to step out, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Panic set in as we rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. The ghostly figure of a woman standing at the front of the classroom. She was dressed in an old-fashioned teacher's outfit, her eyes hollow, and her face twisted in a look of sorrow. The ghost of the teacher stood there, watching us, her hands clasped in front of her, as if waiting for us to respond to her silent plea. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I thought she was going to speak. But instead, she simply raised her hand and pointed to the corner of the room, where a pile of charred desks and chairs had been pushed against the wall. I knew what she was trying to show us. What had happened to her students that night? The children's voices returned, louder this time, their tone more frantic, like they were crying out for help. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on us, as if the room itself was closing in. My friends and I frantically pulled at the door, and finally it gave way. We stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, but the voices followed us, echoing through the dark corridors as we ran toward the exit. As we burst out of the schoolhouse, the voices stopped, and the night air felt unnervingly still. We didn't speak as we hurried back to the car, too shaken to even process what had just happened. The schoolhouse stood behind us, dark and silent once more, but I could still feel the weight of the teacher's gaze, watching us as we fled. Later, I did some digging and found out that the teacher had died in the fire trying to save her students. But none of the children survived. Their spirits, it seemed, were still trapped inside, reliving that final lesson, desperate for someone to acknowledge their fate. And the teacher? She was still searching for the students she couldn't save, trying to finish what she started all those years ago. I've never gone back to that schoolhouse, and I don't plan to, but the memory of that ghostly classroom, of the teacher's sorrowful face, and the cries of her students will stay with me forever. If you're ever in El Paso and decide to visit the old schoolhouse, be prepared. You might find yourself part of a lesson that never ends. Driving along the long, desolate stretches of Route 66 always gave me a sense of freedom. There's something about the open road and the endless horizon that makes you feel like you're a part of something bigger. But on one particular late-night haul, when the air felt unnervingly still, I encountered something that changed the way I'd view that iconic highway forever. I had heard the stories about a woman in an old-fashioned dress seen along the side of the road, waving for help. Most people laughed it off as a myth, but after that night, I wasn't laughing anymore. I had been driving for hours, the desert landscape fading into the darkness around me. The headlights of my truck cut through the night, revealing nothing but the empty road ahead. There wasn't another car in sight, not even a hint of civilization. It was just me, the road, and the hum of the engine. Then, in the distance, I saw her, standing on the shoulder of the highway, dressed in a long, flowing gown, like something out of the early 1900s. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. No one would be out here, not in the middle of nowhere. But as I got closer, it became clear. She was real, or at least I thought she was. She stood there, motionless, her arm raised as if signaling for help. Her face was pale, her hair blowing softly in the wind, though I couldn't see her features clearly. Against my better judgment, I slowed the truck down, intending to pull over and see if she needed help. But the second I passed her, she vanished. Just like that. Gone. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat there in stunned silence, staring into the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there, but the road behind me was empty. The only sound was the faint rumble of the truck's engine. For a moment, I considered getting out to check, but something in my gut told me not to. Something wasn't right. Shaken, I decided to keep driving. But no more than a few minutes later, the temperature in the cab dropped sharply, so much so that I could see my breath. A cold, unnatural chill filled the air, and then I saw her again. This time, she was sitting in the passenger seat. My heart stopped. She wasn't looking at me, just staring out the window, her face expressionless, her hands resting in her lap. I could feel the cold radiating off of her, like she had brought the chill of the grave with her. I didn't know what to do. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. The woman didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her presence was overwhelming, filling the cab with an unbearable heaviness. I could feel my chest tighten as fear coursed through me. This wasn't a normal hitchhiker. I was in the presence of something otherworldly. Suddenly, the truck's radio crackled to life, even though I hadn't turned it on. Static filled the air, followed by faint whispers, voices I couldn't understand. I glanced at the woman, but she remained silent, still staring out the window, as if waiting for something or someone. I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts kicked in, and I slammed my foot down on the gas, desperate to get away from her, from whatever was happening. As the truck sped down the highway, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the cab, and then she was gone. Just like that. 1 second she was there, and the next, the seat beside me was empty. The temperature returned to normal, and the whispers on the radio faded into nothing. But the fear lingered, wrapping itself around me like a vice. I didn't know what I had just experienced, but I knew it wasn't over. For the rest of the drive, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing on the side of the road again, or worse, back in the passenger seat. My mind raced with questions. Who was she? What did she want? I had heard stories about ghosts along Route 66, but I never believed them, until now. The woman in the old-fashioned dress wasn't just a legend. She was real, and she had chosen me for some reason I couldn't understand. When I finally reached my destination, I couldn't bring myself to talk about what had happened. Who would believe me? But the memory of her face, her cold presence, haunted me long after the drive was over. I did some digging and found out that decades ago, a woman had died in a car accident along that stretch of Route 66. Some say she was on her way to meet her husband. Others say she was running from something, or someone. But one thing was clear. Her spirit was still out there, searching for something she would never find. Now, whenever I drive along Route 66, I keep my eyes on the road and my windows locked tight. I haven't seen her again, but I know she's still there waiting for the next unlucky soul to pass by. If you ever find yourself driving down that lonely stretch of highway and you see a woman in a white dress standing by the road, don't stop. Whatever she's looking for, you can't help her. And if you do stop, you might just find yourself with an unexpected passenger. Vicksburg, Mississippi, has always been known for its deep historical roots, especially its pivotal role in the Civil War. But the old bed and breakfast I stayed at during my trip had its own legend, the story of the Wailing Widow. The building had once been part of a Civil War hospital, and according to locals, the spirit of a grieving woman still haunted its halls. She was said to be the widow of a Confederate soldier who died there. Her sorrow too great for her to find peace. I had come to Vicksburg for the history, but I wasn't prepared for what I'd encounter inside that house. From the moment I stepped through the door, I could feel something was off. The air inside the bed and breakfast was heavy, thick with an invisible presence. The house itself was beautiful, with its high ceilings, antique furniture, and large windows that overlooked the grounds where soldiers once walked. But there was an undeniable chill in the air, even in the warmth of summer. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with kind eyes, gave me a knowing look as she handed me the key to my room, as if she had seen this all before. That night, as I settled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind outside howled softly, but inside the house was eerily silent. I was on the verge of sleep when I heard it, a faint, heart-wrenching sob. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing second. I sat up, my heart racing, and listened closely. The crying was coming from the hallway just outside my door. I got out of bed, my hands trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The sobbing grew louder, and I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I would find on the other side. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder here, and the crying sounded as if it was coming from everywhere at once, echoing through the walls. The long, dark corridor stretched before me, empty, except for the flickering shadows cast by a single wall sconce. As I crept down the hallway, the sobbing became more distinct, a woman's voice, filled with grief and despair. I followed the sound, my footsteps soft on the creaky wooden floor, until I reached a small room at the far end of the house. The door was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled out into the hall. I pushed the door open, and there she was. A woman stood near the window, her back to me, dressed in a tattered, blood-stained dress. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and her long hair hung down her back, disheveled and tangled. I froze, too terrified to move. I wanted to call out, to ask if she was okay, but the words caught in my throat. The woman didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my presence. Instead, she continued to cry softly, her head bowed as if she were mourning some great, unbearable loss. My skin crawled as I realized who she was, the Wailing Widow. The legend was true. Without warning, the woman's sobs stopped abruptly. The silence was deafening. Slowly, she turned to face me, and I gasped. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark, filled with an emptiness that made my blood run cold. She looked right through me as if I wasn't really there, her expression one of utter sorrow. Her lips parted, and she whispered one word, her voice barely audible: "Why?" I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. The weight of her grief was palpable, pressing down on me like a physical force. She stepped closer, her hand outstretched, and I felt the temperature in the room plummet. My breath fogged in the air, and I could feel her sadness creeping into me, filling me with a deep sense of loss that wasn't my own. Just as her hand was about to touch mine, she vanished. The room fell silent, the air suddenly warmer, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there, trembling, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The wailing was gone, but the feeling of sorrow lingered, wrapping around me like a cold shroud. I hurried back to my room, too shaken to sleep. The next morning, I spoke to the innkeeper, telling her about the ghostly woman I had seen. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "That was Mary," she said softly. "She lost her husband during the war. He died right here in this house, and she never forgave herself for not being able to save him. The innkeeper explained that Mary had been seen by many guests over the years, always mourning, always searching for her lost love. I left Vicksburg later that day, but the memory of the wailing widow has stayed with me. Her grief, so powerful and all-consuming, bound her spirit to that old house, forever searching for peace that would never come. If you ever stay at that bed and breakfast, be prepared. You might hear her sobs in the dead of night, echoing through the halls, as she searches for her lost love, waiting, always waiting. The fishermen of Cape Cod have always told stories of a ghostly ship that appears on the horizon during storms, its tattered sails flapping in the wind, only to vanish into the mist as quickly as it arrives. I never put much stock into those tales until I found myself on the water one night, chasing that very legend. My friends and I had heard the stories growing up, and on a whim, we decided to rent a small boat to see if we could catch a glimpse of the infamous ghost ship ourselves. We figured it would be a fun, spooky adventure, nothing more. But that night, the ocean had other plans. We set off just before dusk, the sky a swirling mix of purples and grays as a storm brewed on the horizon. The waves were calm at first, gently rocking our boat as we ventured farther from shore. We laughed, sharing drinks and stories, not taking the legends too seriously. But as the storm drew closer, the sea grew rougher, and the air thickened with tension. There was an eerie stillness in the moments before the first raindrop fell, as if the ocean itself was waiting for something to happen. Then, just as the storm hit, we saw it. A ship barely visible through the sheets of rain, its silhouette dark and looming against the turbulent sky. It looked old, far too old to be a modern vessel, with its tall, broken masts and weathered hull. At first, we thought it was just another fishing boat caught in the storm, but as we drew closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary ship. It was the ghost ship, just as the legends had described. The ship seemed to drift aimlessly, its sails torn and flapping wildly in the wind, yet it moved with a strange, unnatural grace. There was no crew on board, at least none that we could see. The storm raged around us, but the ghost ship moved through the waves as if untouched by the chaos. We stared in awe, unsure whether to be terrified or mesmerized. The ship felt like something out of another time, another world, and we couldn't look away. Suddenly, our boat lurched as if something had grabbed hold of it. We scrambled to regain control, but it was as if the sea itself had come alive, pulling us toward the ghost ship. Panic set in as the waves grew higher, crashing over the sides of the boat. The storm roared around us, and the ghost ship loomed closer, its dark, towering figure casting a shadow over us. The wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets, but all I could see was the ship drawing us in like a magnet. As we were pulled closer, we began to hear voices. Faint, ghostly whispers carried on the wind. They seemed to come from the ship, though no one was visible on board. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the spirits of the ship were calling out to us, desperate for something we couldn't understand. My heart raced, and I could feel the cold grip of fear wrapping around me. This wasn't just a legend. The ghost ship was real, and it wanted us. The ship's hull loomed just a few feet away, its weathered wood slick with rain and sea spray. We tried to turn the boat around, but it was no use. The sea had us in its grasp, dragging us toward the ghostly vessel. The voices grew louder, almost pleading now, and then we saw them, ghostly figures, barely visible through the mist, standing on the deck. Their faces were hollow, their eyes dark and empty as they stared down at us. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. Before we knew it, we were alongside the ghost ship, our boat banging against its side. The ghostly crew stood motionless, their forms flickering like shadows in the storm. My blood ran cold as one of the spirits reached out a hand, beckoning us to join them. It was then that I realized what the legends had meant. The ghost ship didn't just haunt the waters. It collected souls, pulling anyone who ventured too close into its eternal voyage. With all our strength, we managed to break free from the ship's pull, the storm still raging around us. We fought against the waves, desperate to put distance between us and the ghostly vessel. The figures on the deck watched us go, their expressions unreadable, as if they were deciding whether or not to let us escape. The wind howled, the waves crashed, and slowly the ghost ship began to fade into the mist, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. When we finally made it back to shore, soaked and shaken, we sat in silence, too stunned to speak. The ghost ship was real, and we had come dangerously close to becoming part of its crew. I couldn't shake the image of those hollow-eyed spirits, standing silently on the deck, waiting for the next unlucky souls to join them. The next morning, I overheard some local fishermen talking about a storm that had rolled in the night before. One of them mentioned seeing a strange ship out on the water, but he dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of the light. I didn't say anything. I knew what we had seen was no illusion. The ghost ship of Cape Cod was real, and it was still out there, sailing the stormy seas, looking for its next crew. If you ever find yourself on the waters off Cape Cod during a storm, be careful. The ghost ship might appear, and if it does, you'd better hope you're far enough away. Because once it locks its sights on you, escaping its grasp isn't guaranteed. It was a quiet, moonlit evening when I arrived in Lexington, Massachusetts, a town steeped in Revolutionary War history. I had always been fascinated by the stories of that era, especially the tales of soldiers who fought and died on the very ground I now walked. But there was one story I hadn't heard until I checked into the local inn, the legend of the spectral drummers. Locals claimed that, late at night, you could hear the sound of drumming coming from the old battlefield, the restless spirits of Revolutionary War soldiers still preparing for a battle that would never come. Intrigued, I decided to stay up and see if the legend was true. The innkeeper had warned me not to go looking for the drummers. "They're not just echoes of the past," she said, her voice serious. "Once they start, they don't stop." But curiosity got the better of me. Around midnight, I left the warmth of the inn and headed toward the old battlefield, a wide, grassy expanse just outside of town. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the field, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. At first it was peaceful, just the quiet of the night and the faint chirping of crickets. But as I walked further into the field, I heard it. The distant, rhythmic thumping of drums. My heart skipped a beat as the sound echoed through the night, faint but unmistakable. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The drumming was slow and steady, as if a ghostly regiment was marching through the fog of time, preparing for a battle long forgotten by the living. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as I ventured deeper into the field. There was no one else around, and yet the drumming persisted, as if an invisible army was right beside me, their feet moving in sync with the beat. I couldn't see them, but I could feel their presence, cold and unrelenting. A chill crept down my spine, and the air grew colder, heavier, like the weight of centuries pressing down on the battlefield. As I moved forward, the drumming became more frantic, more urgent, and with it came the sound of footsteps, heavy, marching footsteps that seemed to surround me on all sides. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the field was empty. Panic started to bubble up in my chest, but I pushed it down, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then, in the distance, I saw them, shadowy figures, barely visible in the moonlight, standing in formation near the far edge of the field. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, as still as statues, their forms dark against the night sky. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. The spectral soldiers of Lexington, trapped in an endless loop of preparation for a battle that had long since passed. The drumming grew louder, almost deafening, as the figures began to march. I stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the shadowy soldiers moved across the field, their feet never touching the ground, their faces obscured by darkness. The air around me was thick with tension, like the very atmosphere was charged with the energy of the past. The drumming was all I could hear, pounding in my ears, echoing through my chest like a heartbeat. It was as if the ground itself was alive with the memory of war, and I was standing in the middle of it. The soldiers marched closer, their forms becoming clearer, but their faces remained hidden, lost to the shadows of time. I wanted to run, to turn back toward the safety of the inn, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, caught between the present and the past, watching as the ghosts of Lexington prepared for a battle they would never fight. The drumming reached a fever pitch, and the air crackled with energy. Suddenly, the drumming stopped. The silence that followed was so abrupt it was almost painful. The spectral soldiers halted in their tracks, their dark forms standing motionless in the moonlit field. For a moment, everything was still, and then, one by one, the figures began to fade, dissolving into the night like mist dissipating in the morning sun. The battlefield was empty once more, but the weight of their presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. The soldiers were gone, but their story remained, etched into the very soil of Lexington. Slowly I turned and made my way back to the inn, the weight of history pressing down on me with every step. I could still hear the faint echo of the drums in my ears, a reminder that some battles never truly end. The next morning, I told the innkeeper what I had experienced. She nodded, unsurprised, and simply said, "They've been marching for centuries. They'll keep marching until they're ready." I left Lexington that day, but the memory of the spectral drummers has stayed with me ever since. If you ever find yourself walking the fields of Lexington at night, listen closely. The soldiers are still there, preparing for a battle that will never come. A private tour of Alcatraz Island seemed like the ultimate thrill for a group of history buffs like us. We'd read about the infamous prison, its history of housing notorious criminals, and the tales of failed escape attempts. But the real draw was the stories of hauntings, whispers of ghostly figures wandering the abandoned cells, echoes of the past that refused to fade. We thought it was all part of the mystique, just exaggerated legends. None of us expected to experience the island's darker side firsthand. As the boat pulled up to the island, the once imposing prison loomed ahead of us, its decaying walls casting long shadows in the fading afternoon light. The air was cooler out here, the wind whipping through the bay, and the silence was unsettling. We were given a brief introduction by the tour guide before being left to explore Alcatraz on our own, just as the sun began to set. The guide warned us to stick together and not to wander too far into the more deteriorated parts of the prison. Looking back, we should have taken that advice more seriously. The first hour was fascinating, walking through the cold, echoing halls of the prison, imagining the lives of the inmates who had once been confined to these narrow cells. But as dusk fell and the shadows deepened, the atmosphere shifted. What had once been a place of curiosity became oppressive, the weight of the past pressing down on us. The sound of our footsteps seemed to carry unnaturally far, bouncing off the walls in ways that made us feel like we weren't alone. It started with the doors. We were standing in the cell block known as D Block, where the most dangerous inmates were held in solitary confinement. As we walked past the rows of cells, the heavy iron doors began to slam shut, one after the other, echoing through the block. There was no one else around. At first, we thought it was the wind or a malfunction in the aging structure, but the slamming was rhythmic, almost deliberate. My heart raced as the realization set in. Something unseen was moving through the prison with us. Trying to laugh it off, we continued our exploration, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. In the silence between our conversations, we began to hear faint voices, low murmurs, like someone whispering just out of earshot. We followed the sound, but every time we thought we were getting closer, the voices seemed to move further away, luring us deeper into the bowels of the prison. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, remembering every conversation, every plea for freedom. Then one of us, the youngest in the group, swore he saw movement in one of the cells. We all turned, our flashlights illuminating the space where he pointed, and for a brief moment, we saw it too. A shadowy figure stood in the corner of the cell, dressed in the striped prison uniform that hadn't been worn for decades. His face was indistinct, blurred by the shadows, but his presence was undeniable. And just as quickly as we saw him, he was gone, leaving us standing there in stunned silence. From that point on, the tour turned from curiosity to fear. The air grew colder, and every noise seemed amplified, the clanking of metal, the distant sound of chains rattling. We made our way to the shower area, where we heard the unmistakable sound of laughter, deep and mocking, though there was no one else around. It was as if the ghosts of the inmates were playing with us, teasing us with their presence, reminding us that this was their territory, and we were intruding. As the night wore on, we began to see more figures, ghostly silhouettes pacing back and forth in the long corridors, their forms flickering like old film reels. Each time we approached, they would disappear, leaving only the eerie silence behind. But the most disturbing moment came when we entered the cafeteria. We heard the faint sound of metal trays being dragged across the tables, and then, in the dim light, we saw them, shadowy figures seated at the tables, eating their phantom meals as if they had never left. Panic began to set in as the figures stood up and turned toward us. Their faces were shrouded in darkness, but we could feel their eyes on us, cold and unforgiving. We backed out of the cafeteria, our nerves frayed, but the feeling of being followed was overwhelming. The footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed behind us as we hurried back toward the main cell block. Every step we took felt like a race against time, as if the ghosts were closing in on us. By the time we reached the entrance to the prison, we were practically running. The doors slammed shut behind us as we stepped out into the cool night air. The island's oppressive grip finally releasing us. We stood there, catching our breath, too shaken to speak. The boat ride back to the mainland was silent, the weight of what we had experienced hanging over us like a dark cloud. None of us dared to look back at the island. I haven't returned to Alcatraz since that night, and I'm not sure I ever will. The prison may be abandoned, but it is far from empty. The phantom tenants, those who lived, suffered, and died behind those walls, are still there, pacing their cells, waiting for the next group of visitors to disturb their restless existence. If you ever find yourself on Alcatraz, remember, it may be a historical landmark, but for the spirits trapped inside, it's still a prison. Nantucket's shores have always been steeped in maritime legend, but nothing prepared me for the story of the lantern ghosts. I had gone to the island for a quiet vacation to escape the rush of city life and lose myself in the charm of the coast. On my second night there, while chatting with a local bartender, I heard about the ghostly lanterns that appeared along the beach during foggy nights. The locals spoke of long-dead fishermen, their spirits forever wandering the shoreline, their lanterns glowing faintly through the mist. Intrigued, I decided to see if the tale was true. That evening, the fog rolled in thick, swallowing the coastline and turning the beach into a ghostly world of shadows. Armed with only a flashlight, I ventured out onto the sand. The air was cold, and the distant crash of waves was the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. The fog was so dense it felt like a living thing, wrapping around me as I walked along the beach. For a while, I saw nothing unusual, just the dark, endless stretch of mist-shrouded shoreline. And then I saw it. Faint at first, just a small flicker of light through the fog, like a distant candle flame swaying in the breeze. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the glow. It didn't move like the beam of a flashlight or the headlights of a car. It was softer, older, like a lantern swaying gently in someone's hand. I blinked, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, but the glow persisted, growing brighter as it drifted closer. I stood frozen, watching as the light drew nearer, and soon I realized there was more than one. Several glowing orbs, like lanterns, bobbed along the shore, moving slowly through the fog. My pulse quickened as the eerie lights approached, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. There were no figures, no visible people holding the lanterns, just the lights, moving as if guided by unseen hands. The realization hit me like a cold wave. These were the lantern ghosts the locals had warned me about. As the lights passed by, I could hear the faint sound of voices carried on the wind. They were low and indistinct, like the murmurs of men talking quietly to one another. I strained to listen, trying to make out the words, but the voices were just out of reach, like they belonged to another time. The fog swirled around me, thick and impenetrable, and for a moment it felt as though I was standing on the edge of two worlds, the living and the dead. Suddenly, one of the lanterns stopped, hovering in place just a few yards away from me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't moving away like the others. The light flickered, and I could feel the air grow colder, heavier. My body tensed as the soft, ghostly glow of the lantern seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. Then, without warning, the light moved toward me, slowly at first, but gaining speed with each passing second. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my feet sinking into the sand as I sprinted back toward the safety of the dunes. The fog was so thick, I could barely see where I was going, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel the cold presence of the lantern ghost behind me, its eerie light illuminating the fog around me like some spectral searchlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed myself to move faster, the weight of the night pressing down on me. Just as I reached the edge of the beach, the light vanished. I collapsed onto the sand, gasping for air, my body trembling with fear. The fog had swallowed the lanterns once again, leaving the beach eerily silent. For a long time I sat there, staring out at the misty shoreline, half expecting the lights to return, but the ghosts had retreated back into the fog, their lanterns dimmed once more. The beach was quiet, but the weight of what I had experienced lingered. The next morning, I told one of the locals about my encounter. He nodded solemnly, his weathered face lined with understanding. "The lantern ghosts," he said. "Those poor fishermen, they never made it back to shore. Their ships went down in the fog, and they've been searching for home ever since. They'll lead you right into the ocean if you follow them." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I had been lucky. If I hadn't turned and run, I might have been lured to the water's edge, just like those lost sailors. I haven't returned to that beach at night since then. The lantern ghosts are still out there, forever wandering the shores of Nantucket, their glowing lights searching for a way home. And if you're ever walking the beach on a foggy night, be careful. If you see a faint light in the distance, don't follow it. The lantern ghosts are always looking for new souls to join them in their endless search for the shore. Mount Shasta had always been a place of mystery, its towering peak shrouded in legend and lore. I had heard the stories of strange disappearances, odd lights in the sky, and the whispers carried on the wind. The mountain seemed to attract people who were drawn to the unknown, and I was no exception. As an experienced mountaineer, I'd climbed many peaks, but Shasta felt different. There was something about it, something that made you feel like you were never truly alone. Still, the rumors about hikers vanishing into the mist intrigued me, and I wanted to see the mountain for myself. It was late summer when I made the trek, the skies clear and the air crisp as I began my ascent. The higher I climbed, the more isolated I felt, the sound of the wind and the crunch of gravel under my boots the only noises in the stillness. The beauty of Mount Shasta was undeniable, but there was also an undercurrent of unease. As I approached the tree line, the wind began to change. What had been a steady breeze turned into something more, almost like a low murmur, barely audible but persistent, as if the wind was carrying voices. At first I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but as I continued my climb, the whispers grew more distinct. It sounded like words, faint and scattered, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I stopped to listen, my heart pounding in my chest, but every time I tried to focus on the sound, it would fade, teasing me like a distant conversation just out of reach. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I pressed on, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached the higher slopes, the wind was howling, the whispers carried along with it. The sky had darkened unexpectedly, thick clouds rolling in from nowhere, and the once clear path ahead was now obscured by mist. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I had to slow my pace. The whispers were louder now, swirling around me, too fragmented to understand but too persistent to ignore. I started to feel lightheaded, like the air itself was growing thin, and that's when I saw them, shadowy figures moving through the fog. I froze, my eyes straining to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures moved slowly, almost gliding, their forms barely discernible in the mist. They seemed human, but there was something off about them, something unnatural. My heart raced as one of the figures turned toward me, its face obscured by the swirling fog, and for a moment I felt a deep, bone-chilling cold. The figure beckoned to me, its arm raised as if inviting me to follow. Fear gripped me, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away. The whispers intensified, wrapping around me like the wind itself was trying to pull me closer to these ghostly apparitions. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Were they other hikers? Lost souls? The legends of Mount Shasta came flooding back. Stories of ancient spirits, of people vanishing into the mountain's depths, never to be seen again. I didn't know what to believe, but every instinct told me to turn back. I took a step backward, my legs trembling as I tried to break free from the trance-like state that had overtaken me. The figures remained where they were, watching, waiting. With every step I took away from them, the whispers seemed to grow more frantic, as if they were warning me not to leave. The air felt thick, oppressive, and my head spun as I struggled to breathe. I stumbled, catching myself just before I fell, and that's when I saw it, a faint, glowing light deep within the fog, far below the surface of the mountain. The light pulsed faintly, beckoning me just like the figures had. My heart raced as I stared at it, the whispers swirling around me, growing louder, more insistent. For a brief moment, I considered following the light, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. But something deep inside me screamed that it was a trap, that whatever lay ahead was not something I wanted to find. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and bolted in the opposite direction, desperate to put as much distance as I could between myself and the eerie presence that seemed to envelop the mountain. The descent was a blur of fear and adrenaline. The wind roared around me, the whispers now a cacophony of voices, pleading, demanding, calling my name. I didn't stop until I reached the tree line, my legs burning and my lungs screaming for air. Only when I was certain the mist had thinned and the wind had died down did I allow myself to breathe. The whispers had stopped, the figures gone, but the weight of what I had seen still pressed heavily on me. When I finally made it back to the base of the mountain, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The sky had cleared, the mist gone as if it had never been there, and the mountain stood tall and silent once more. But I knew what I had experienced was real. The whispers, the figures, the strange light, they weren't just in my head. Mount Shasta held secrets, dark and ancient, and I had come far too close to uncovering them. I never returned to Mount Shasta after that day. The mountain is beautiful, yes, but it's also dangerous, not just in the physical sense, but in the way it draws people in, tempting them to explore its mysteries. If you ever find yourself on its slopes and you hear the wind whispering your name, turn back. The spirits of Mount Shasta are always waiting, and once they find you, they won't let go. I've always had a soft spot for antiques, so when I stumbled upon a quaint little shop in Charleston during a weekend getaway, I couldn't resist stepping inside. The place was filled with the kinds of treasures you only find in old southern cities: worn furniture, vintage jewelry, and old toys. Among the collection was a porcelain doll tucked away in a dusty corner, with a delicate white dress and wide, unblinking eyes. It caught my attention immediately. Something about the doll seemed almost lifelike. The shop owner noticed my interest and smiled, though there was something off about the way he looked at the doll. "That one's been here for as long as I can remember," he said, a strange edge in his voice. I bought the doll, thinking it would make a charming gift for my daughter. She loved all things vintage, and this doll seemed like the perfect addition to her collection. As I drove home with it in the passenger seat, the streets of Charleston faded behind me, and I felt a creeping unease settle over me, though I tried to brush it off. The doll sat silently, its wide eyes seeming to follow the movement of the car. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about it, but I told myself it was just my imagination. When I gave the doll to my daughter, she was thrilled. She placed it on the shelf in her room, right next to her other dolls, and that's when the strange things began to happen. It started small at first. Doors would creak open on their own, lights would flicker, and objects would be moved from where we had left them. My daughter swore she wasn't doing it, and though I tried to believe her, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. One night, I was walking past her room when I heard her talking softly to someone. I assumed she was on the phone, but when I peeked inside, she was sitting on the floor, facing the shelf where the doll sat. She wasn't holding a phone. She was talking to the doll. I froze in the doorway, listening as she whispered something I couldn't quite make out. Her back was to me, but the doll's eyes seemed to be locked on mine, as if it knew I was there. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I quietly backed out of the room, trying to shake off the unease. The next morning, I asked my daughter about it. She shrugged as if it was the most natural thing in the world, and said the doll had been talking to her since the night before. My heart skipped a beat. She claimed the doll had told her stories about a little girl who used to own it, a girl who had died a long time ago. I tried to laugh it off, telling her it was just her imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The doll had an energy about it, something dark and unsettling. Over the next few days, things escalated. My daughter became more withdrawn, spending hours alone in her room with the doll. She stopped playing with her other toys, stopped talking to me as much. One evening, I found her sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, the doll cradled in her arms. When I asked her what she was doing, she turned to me with an expression I didn't recognize. Her eyes distant, her voice flat. "She's coming," she whispered. "The little girl is coming for me." That night, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. Groggy and confused, I got up to check on my daughter. When I opened her bedroom door, the sight that greeted me sent chills down my spine. The doll was no longer on the shelf. It was lying in the middle of the floor, and my daughter was standing by the window again, staring out into the darkness. Her hands were pressed against the glass, and she was whispering something I couldn't understand. I rushed over to her, shaking her gently, and she snapped out of her trance-like state, looking around in confusion. She had no memory of how she had gotten there. I scooped her up and took her to my room, trying to calm my racing heart. The doll stayed behind, its cold, glassy eyes watching as we left the room. I knew then that I couldn't keep it in the house any longer. Whatever curse the doll carried, it was trying to claim my daughter. The next morning, I returned to the antique shop, doll in hand, ready to demand answers. The shop owner wasn't surprised to see me. In fact, he seemed to be expecting me. "That doll doesn't belong to anyone," he said quietly. "It's been passed around for years, and every time someone tries to keep it, things go wrong." He explained that the doll had once belonged to a little girl who had died tragically in the early 1900s. Since then, it had carried her spirit, attaching itself to anyone who dared take it home. I left the doll with him, refusing to ask any more questions. I just wanted it gone, out of my life and out of my daughter's. I never told her what I had done, and though she asked about the doll for a few days, she eventually forgot. But I haven't forgotten. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the doll is still sitting in that dusty old shop, waiting for the next curious soul to come along and take it home. And I wonder if, somewhere in Charleston, there's still a little girl searching for a new friend to play with. It was my first week as a rookie firefighter in Chicago, and I had been assigned to one of the city's oldest firehouses, a building that had survived the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The station had a storied history, and the older guys loved to share tales of the firefighters who had served before us, some of whom had died in the line of duty. But there was one story they didn't like to talk about: the legend of the phantom firefighters. They said that, late at night, you could hear the sound of footsteps in the halls, and sometimes, if you were unlucky, you might catch a glimpse of them. Firefighters from long ago, still on duty, waiting for a fire that would never come. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just one of those things older firefighters tell the rookies to mess with them. But after a few quiet nights, I started noticing things. Strange things. The firehouse was old, sure, but the noises didn't feel like the usual creaks and groans of an old building. Late at night, when the rest of the crew was asleep, I'd hear the sound of heavy boots walking through the halls, stopping outside the door of the bunk room. I'd get up to check, but every time, the hallways were empty. One night, I was assigned to stay late for a shift change. The firehouse was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. I was sitting in the kitchen, flipping through a magazine when I heard it again, those heavy, deliberate footsteps. This time they weren't just passing through the halls, they were coming down the stairs, getting closer and closer. My heart started to race as I stood up and listened, expecting one of the guys to walk through the door. But no one did. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen door, and for a long moment, everything was still. I held my breath, waiting, but no one came in. Finally, I worked up the courage to check the hallway. It was empty. My skin prickled with unease. The air felt different, colder, heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was off. The firehouse wasn't empty. Later that week, during a late-night call, I asked one of the older firefighters about the phantom firefighters. He sighed and told me that many years ago, during the Great Chicago Fire, several firefighters from our station had died while trying to save a collapsing building. Their spirits, he said, never left the firehouse. They stayed behind, still waiting for the next alarm, still ready to fight a fire that would never come. It was just a story, he assured me, but the look in his eyes told me he believed it more than he wanted to admit. A few nights after that conversation, I was back on the night shift. It was a quiet evening, no calls, no alarms. As I sat in the lounge, the lights flickered, and a sudden chill filled the air. I looked up, and there they were, 3 figures standing in the shadows at the far end of the room. They wore old-fashioned firefighting gear, their uniforms dirty and worn, their faces obscured by the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at them, too shocked to move. They didn't say anything, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching. I blinked, and in that instant, they were gone. The lights flickered again, and the room felt warm once more. But the memory of those ghostly figures stayed with me. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? But the phantom firefighters were real, and I had seen them with my own eyes. After that, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Lights would turn on and off by themselves, doors would open and close without anyone nearby, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the station at all hours of the night. The crew joked about the ghosts, but I knew they were real. Every night, as I lay in my bunk, I could hear the sound of boots pacing back and forth, as if the phantom firefighters were patrolling the halls, keeping watch over the station. One night, the alarm went off, and we scrambled to respond to a call. As we raced to get our gear on, I noticed something strange. In the reflection of the windows, I saw them again, those same 3 figures, suiting up alongside us. My heart raced as I glanced around the room, but no one else seemed to notice. The phantom firefighters were gearing up, just like they had done so many years ago, ready for a fire that no longer existed. As we pulled out of the station, the reflection disappeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been there, preparing to respond with us. The call turned out to be a false alarm, but the experience stayed with me. The phantom firefighters weren't just legends. They were still there, still waiting for the next call, still ready to do their duty. To this day, whenever I walk the halls of that old firehouse, I can feel them. The spirits of those brave men who gave their lives so long ago, still watching over the station, still waiting for the next fire. If you ever find yourself in one of Chicago's old firehouses late at night, listen closely. You might hear the footsteps of the phantom firefighters, still on duty, still answering the call that never came. There's an old house in Detroit's west side that has a reputation for being haunted. The place had been abandoned for years, left to rot with boarded-up windows and overgrown weeds swallowing the yard. Yet, for as long as anyone could remember, neighbors reported hearing the sound of a baby crying late at night. I didn't believe it when I first heard the stories. After all, urban legends grow wild in old cities like Detroit, but that changed when I moved into the house next door. The house was a wreck, sure, but it had good bones, and I thought it had potential. From the moment I moved in, the locals made it clear that something was wrong with the house next door. They avoided it like the plague, especially after dark. One evening, I asked a neighbor about it, and he just shook his head, muttering something about the crying baby. He wouldn't say more, but the look on his face told me enough. He believed it. A week later, I heard it for the first time. It was just after midnight, and I had been asleep when a faint sound woke me. At first, I thought it was a stray cat or maybe a distant car alarm, but as I listened closer, my blood ran cold. It was a baby crying, soft at first but persistent. It echoed through the walls of the house next door, muffled but unmistakable. I got up, peered through my window, but the old house was as dark and lifeless as ever. The crying continued night after night, always around the same time. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank or an animal, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. The sound was too human, too chilling. The worst part, no matter how closely I listened, the source of the crying seemed to shift, like it was coming from different parts of the house. Sometimes the attic, sometimes the basement. It felt like the baby was moving, searching for something. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check out the house for myself. I grabbed a flashlight and headed over just after sunset. The old place loomed ahead of me, its broken windows staring back like dead eyes. As I pushed open the rusted gate, a sudden chill ran through me. The air felt heavier here, like the house was holding its breath. I told myself it was just nerves and forced myself to step inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the crying started again, but this time it was louder, closer. The sound filled the empty rooms, bouncing off the decaying walls. My heart raced as I moved through the house, trying to follow the noise. Every step felt like walking through a nightmare. The floors creaked beneath me, and the air grew colder the deeper I went. The crying led me to the stairs, and without thinking, I climbed them, each step echoing louder than the last. When I reached the top, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. I stood frozen, listening for any sign of movement, but the house was still. That's when I noticed something. The faint sound of a lullaby, barely audible, like someone humming just out of earshot. My stomach twisted with dread, but I couldn't stop myself from walking with it. I followed the humming to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and the moment I touched it, the crying started again, louder and more frantic than before. I pushed the door open, and my heart nearly stopped. In the middle of the room, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight from the broken window, was an old crib. The wood was rotting, the mattress stained and torn, but there was no baby. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. The crying grew louder, more desperate, like the baby was right there, crying for help. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows near the crib. It was a woman, her face pale and hollow, her eyes filled with sorrow. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel the weight of her grief pressing down on me. I turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs and out of the house as fast as I could. The crying followed me, growing fainter with each step until finally it was gone. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my own house, my heart still racing, my mind spinning. The crying baby wasn't just a legend, it was real, and whatever tragedy had unfolded in that house so many years ago still lingered, echoing through the walls like a broken record. The next day, I packed up and left. I couldn't stay, not after what I'd seen and heard. The crying still haunts me, even now. Sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I think I can still hear it. Faint, distant, like a memory that refuses to fade. And I wonder, is the baby still crying? Is the mother still searching for her child? The house is still there, abandoned and decaying, a monument to a tragedy no one talks about. And if you ever find yourself walking the streets of Detroit late at night, listen closely. You might hear the sound of a baby crying, and if you do, turn away. Some things are better left forgotten. Butte, Montana is a place where the past never quite lets go. Once a bustling mining town, it's now a quiet reminder of the lives that were lost deep beneath the earth. The old mines have long since shut down, but stories about the men who died down there linger. Some say the spirits of the miners never left, that they still roam the abandoned tunnels searching for the treasure they were promised but never found. I didn't believe it, of course. That is, until I took a tour of the old mines myself. It was a cold autumn afternoon when I joined a group of tourists for a guided tour through the dilapidated mine. Our guide, an older man with a gruff voice and years of mining knowledge, led us deep into the tunnels, telling us tales of Butte's glory days. The air grew cooler the further we descended, and the darkness closed in around us, the only light coming from our headlamps. Despite the history lesson, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the mine itself was alive. About halfway through the tour, we reached a section of the mine that had been closed off due to a catastrophic collapse over a century ago. The guide stopped us there, pointing out the makeshift memorials set up by families who had lost loved ones in the collapse. The names of the miners were etched into the crumbling walls, their stories lost to time. As the guide spoke, I thought I heard something. Faint, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a pickaxe striking stone. At first, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, but then it came again, clearer this time. The rhythmic clinking of metal on rock echoed faintly through the tunnels, growing louder as the minutes passed. I looked around, expecting someone else to react, but no one seemed to notice. The guide continued speaking, his voice bouncing off the narrow walls. But my attention was focused on the sounds, steady, persistent, and undeniably real. The miners were still working. As we moved deeper into the mine, the sounds grew louder, joined by the faint murmur of voices. It was like listening to a conversation from another room, low, indistinct, but definitely there. My skin prickled with unease, and I glanced over at the others in the group. A few of them looked uneasy as well, their eyes darting around the dark corners of the tunnel. The guide, however, seemed unfazed. Maybe he was used to it, or maybe he just didn't hear it. But I did. Suddenly, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, we were plunged into darkness, and my heart raced. When the lights came back on, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, moving in the shadows at the far end of the tunnel. It was quick, just a flicker of movement, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The figure was dressed in old mining gear, the kind worn by the men who had worked these tunnels 100 years ago. But when I blinked, it was gone. I wasn't the only one who saw it. A woman at the back of the group gasped, and the guide, sensing the growing tension, tried to reassure us. "Just the shadows playing tricks," he said, his voice calm, but there was a nervous edge to it. The clinking of pickaxes and the soft murmurs of voices persisted, growing louder the further we went. The guide quickened his pace, clearly eager to get us out of there. As we neared the end of the tour, the voices grew clearer. It wasn't just murmuring anymore, it was full conversations, though I couldn't make out the words. It was like the miners were still down there, working tirelessly, unaware that their time had passed. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in on us. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down. We needed to leave. Just before we reached the exit, the tunnel grew unnervingly quiet. The clinking stopped, the voices faded, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our footsteps echoing through the dark. But then, from deep within the mine, a single voice rang out, clear, desperate, and filled with anguish. "Help us." My blood ran cold. It wasn't a whisper or a murmur. It was a plea, a cry for help from the depths of the earth, and it sent a shiver down my spine like nothing I'd ever felt before. We hurried out of the mine, the cold autumn air feeling like a welcome embrace as we emerged from the suffocating darkness. No one spoke for a long time, the weight of what we had heard hanging over us like a dark cloud. The guide made a few half-hearted jokes about the ghosts of the miners, but none of us were laughing. What we had experienced wasn't a trick of the light or the imagination. The miners were still down there, trapped in the tunnels, still searching for something they would never find. I left Butte the next morning, but the memory of that mine still haunts me. The cries of the miners, the clinking of their pickaxes, the ghostly figures moving through the shadows, none of it felt like a legend anymore. It was real. If you ever find yourself in Butte, Montana, and decide to tour the old mines, be prepared. The miners never left, and they're still waiting for someone to dig them out. The Oregon coast is known for its rugged beauty, but it's also a place where the sea meets the sky in a way that makes you feel small, insignificant even. I had been living in a small coastal town for a few months, enjoying the tranquility that came with the sound of crashing waves and the cool, misty air. But I soon learned that the cliffs overlooking the ocean had their own dark history. Fishermen and lighthouse keepers often spoke of shadow figures appearing on the cliffs during storms, always watching, never moving. It was an old legend, one that locals told with a shiver, but I never gave it much thought, until I saw them for myself. It was during one of those heavy coastal storms that roll in out of nowhere, with winds that howl through the trees and waves that crash violently against the shore. I had been walking along the cliffs near the lighthouse, my jacket pulled tight against the biting wind, when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the rocks. The rain was coming down hard, and visibility was low, but there was no mistaking the dark outline of a person standing there, completely still, facing the sea. At first, I thought it was another hiker or maybe a fisherman braving the storm. But as I got closer, something about the figure seemed off. They weren't dressed for the weather. No raincoat, no hat, just a shadowy form swaying slightly in the wind. I called out, but the wind snatched my voice away before it could reach them. The figure didn't react, didn't even seem to hear me. I quickened my pace, trying to get a better look. But as I drew nearer, the figure vanished, just like that, as if the storm had swallowed them whole. I stopped in my tracks, scanning the cliffs for any sign of the person, but there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, the wind and rain lashing against me. The cliffs were empty, save for the angry waves crashing below. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The figure had been too real, too solid to be a trick of the light. Shaken, I made my way back to town, trying to push the experience out of my mind. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked a few locals about the shadow figures on the cliffs, and their reactions only deepened my unease. Everyone I spoke to had a story, a sighting of their own, a relative who had seen the figures during storms, always standing at the edge of the cliffs, always watching the sea. And the strangest part? No one could ever get close to them. The figures would disappear before anyone could reach them. One old fisherman told me the figures were the spirits of sailors who had died in a shipwreck long ago. Their bodies were never recovered, and now their ghosts returned to the cliffs during every storm, waiting for their ship to come in. I wanted to dismiss it as a local legend, but after what I'd seen, I wasn't so sure. The next time a storm rolled in, I found myself drawn back to the cliffs, compelled to see the figures again, to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The wind was even stronger this time, howling through the trees like a living thing. The sky was dark, the clouds heavy and menacing, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks below. As I approached the cliffs, I saw them again, 3 shadowy figures standing at the edge, completely still, their backs to me. My heart raced, but I couldn't stop myself from moving closer. I had to know what they were. As I got closer, the wind seemed to pick up, and the figures began to sway in unison, like they were part of the storm itself. I called out again, but just like before, my voice was swallowed by the wind. The figures didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I was only a few feet away now, close enough to make out their forms, dark, indistinct, but undeniably human. And then, just as before, they vanished. This time, though, I saw something else. As the figures disappeared, a strange mist began to rise from the sea, swirling around the base of the cliffs. In the distance, I heard a faint sound, like the tolling of a bell, far out at sea. The wind howled even louder, and the mist grew thicker, creeping up the cliffs like fingers reaching out of the water. My skin prickled with fear, and I knew I had to leave. I turned and ran, the wind pushing against me as I scrambled back to the safety of the lighthouse. When I finally made it inside, I was drenched, my heart still pounding in my chest. The keeper, an old man who had lived on the coast his whole life, took one look at me and nodded knowingly. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded, still too shaken to speak. He told me that the shadow figures had been appearing for as long as anyone could remember, always during storms, always watching the sea. According to the lighthouse keeper, the figures were waiting for something, a ship that would never return. They had been sailors once, lost to the ocean, their bodies never found. Now they were cursed to stand on the cliffs, watching and waiting, hoping for a rescue that would never come. The tolling bell I had heard, he said, was the sound of their ship's bell, still calling out through the fog, long after the ship itself had been claimed by the sea. I've seen the shadow figures a few times since then, always during storms, always standing at the edge of the cliffs. I've stopped trying to get close. Whatever they are, they belong to the sea now, lost in a storm that never ends. If you ever find yourself on the Oregon coast during a storm, keep an eye on the cliffs. You might see them, those dark, watching figures, waiting for a ship that will never return. The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful, but they've always had a reputation for being haunted. People talk about old spirits, phantom lights, and eerie sounds that echo through the valleys at night. But the strangest story I'd heard was about a ghost car, a vehicle that supposedly races alongside drivers before vanishing into thin air. I'd heard the tale from a friend who grew up in the area, but like most urban legends, I didn't believe it. At least, not until I experienced it myself. I was driving through the mountains late one evening, heading back from a weekend getaway. The sun had set, and the twisting, narrow roads were cloaked in darkness. The air was cool, and the thick canopy of trees made the road feel even more isolated. I had my windows down, letting the fresh mountain breeze in as I navigated the sharp turns. It was peaceful, or at least it was until I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another car on these winding roads was nothing unusual, but something about the headlights felt off. They were too bright, too close. It was as if the car behind me was speeding up, pushing me to go faster. I glanced again in the rearview mirror, but the car seemed different, older, like something out of a distant past. Its headlights flickered unnaturally, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I pressed my foot on the gas, increasing my speed as I rounded another sharp bend. But no matter how fast I went, the ghostly car stayed right behind me, matching my speed perfectly. My heart raced as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep my eyes on the road ahead. The twists and turns of the mountain roads were dangerous enough without the pressure of this phantom vehicle tailing me so closely. And then, without warning, it pulled up alongside me. It was an old car, something from the 1950s, its faded black paint barely visible in the dim light. The windows were tinted, but I could feel the presence of something or someone inside, watching me. The car seemed to drift effortlessly beside me, as if the laws of physics didn't apply. I glanced over, trying to make out the driver, but all I could see was a shadowy figure behind the wheel. A cold chill ran down my spine. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just drove alongside me in eerie silence. Panic set in. I pushed the pedal to the floor, hoping to outrun whatever this thing was, but the car matched my speed without any effort. I could hear the engine roaring, but it didn't sound like any engine I had ever heard before. It was distorted, almost like it was echoing from another time. The road twisted again, and I narrowly avoided swerving off the edge of the mountain. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hands were slick with sweat. The ghost car showed no signs of stopping. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, The car veered off into the darkness, disappearing around the next curve. I hit the brakes, my tires screeching on the pavement as I came to a halt. My pulse was racing, my mind spinning as I tried to process what had just happened. The road ahead was empty, the headlights of the ghost car gone as if it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, broken only by the soft rustle of the trees in the wind. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was it a prank? An old car someone was restoring? But the way it moved, the way it felt, it was like something out of a nightmare. I couldn't shake the feeling that what I had seen wasn't just another car. It was something else entirely, something not of this world. Eventually, I mustered the courage to start driving again. I kept my speed slow, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, half expecting the ghost car to return at any moment. But the rest of the drive was uneventful, the twisting roads empty and quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the car was still out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for its next target. When I got back home, I told my friend what had happened. He didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. Instead, he nodded grimly. "You saw it," he said. "The ghost car." He explained that many people had reported seeing the same thing over the years. An old car from decades past that appears out of nowhere, racing alongside drivers before vanishing into the night. Some say it's the spirit of a reckless driver who died in a crash on those same mountain roads. Others believe it's something darker, a specter from a time long forgotten, cursed to roam the roads forever. I haven't driven through the Appalachian Mountains at night since then. The thought of that car, the way it appeared and disappeared, still haunts me. If you ever find yourself on those winding roads late at night and see headlights in your rearview mirror, be careful. It might just be another car, or it might be something else entirely. Something that doesn't belong to this world, but is still looking for a race it will never win.